Get comfortable. Turn down the lights if you have not already. Pull a blanket a little closer if one is nearby. Maybe you are in bed already halfway there, already feeling the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders. Maybe you are on a couch with the glow of a screen in a dark room, and everyone else in the house is asleep. And this is your time, the quiet hours that belong to you. However you arrived here tonight, whatever path of links and recommendations and late-night browsing led you to this particular video at this particular hour, it does not matter. You are here now. That is the only thing that is true. We are going to spend the next several hours together. And I do mean several hours. This is not a short video. It was never going to be a short video because the subject does not lend itself to short treatment. We are going to go through every questionable, controversial, dark, strange, and genuinely difficult moment in the history of one American animated television show. A show about a family in a fictional Rhode Island town. A show that debuted in 1999 and is, as of this recording, still on the air. A show that has generated more press releases from advocacy organizations, more angry letters to television regulators, more academic papers on the nature of comedy and harm, and more genuine national controversy than almost any other program in the history of American network television. We will go through the episodes that were banned before they could air. The episodes that were pulled from streaming services after real-world events made their content suddenly unacceptable. The episodes that aired without incident and then sat in the collective memory of the audience for years, growing slowly more uncomfortable as the culture around them shifted. The characters who were played for laughs in ways that eventually required public statements. The moments that the show itself seemed to understand were wrong, and the moments that the show clearly did not understand were wrong at all, which in some ways were more troubling. All of it will be described to you in a calm voice, in order, with detail and context and the kind of unhurried attention that this material deserves. You do not have to watch. You do not have to stay awake. This is designed to be listened to in the dark, the way you might fall asleep to a documentary or a podcast, letting the voice carry you through the material without requiring your full conscious attention. The information will be here when you want it. The rest of it will pass gently over you while you sleep. There is something specific and comforting about hearing familiar things described in careful detail. If you have watched any of these episodes, if you remember any of these controversies, there is a particular kind of ease that comes from hearing them spoken aloud with patience, like revisiting a place you know well, in good company, with no particular schedule. That is what we are going for. So let us begin, not with drama, not with the most explosive moment or the most discussed episode. Let us begin at the beginning, with a young man from Connecticut and the two short films that changed American television. Part 1. The DNA of the show, and why it was always going to be this way. There is a man named Seth Woodbury MacFarlane who was born in October of 1973 inches, a small town in Connecticut called Kent. Kent is the kind of New England town that feels self-contained and deliberate, the kind of place where the seasons are distinct, and the architecture is old, and the local identity is specific in ways that larger cities tend not to produce. His father was an admissions officer, and his mother was a French teacher, both at the same private school, a school called Kent School. He grew up in an educated, structured environment, the kind of household where books were plentiful and creative pursuits were taken seriously. He was a strange and gifted child in the particular way that children who will go on to become artists sometimes are, meaning he was funny in ways that felt slightly beyond his age, that felt like they came from some combination of careful observation and innate timing that you cannot quite teach. He drew constantly. He made things. He had a facility for voices from a young age, for mimicking and inhabiting the vocal patterns of other people and characters in ways that gave him an audience in every room he walked into. He was not trying to be the center of attention in any aggressive way. He just happened to be someone who found a particular pleasure in performance, and performance found him. He went to the Rhode Island School of Design, which sits on College Hill in Providence, Rhode Island, which is a city that manages to feel historic and compact at the same time. RISD, as it is known, is one of the most prestigious art and design schools in the United States. Admission is selective. The culture is serious. Students there tend to have already demonstrated that they are going to do something specific and creative with their time on Earth, and the school is designed to help them do it. MacFarlane studied film, video, and animation there. He graduated in 1995 with a specific skill set and a fairly clear sense of the kind of work he wanted to make. After graduation, he went to Los Angeles, as people who want to work in animation tend to do, and he got a job at Hanna-Barbera, the studio that had produced a staggering portion of American animated television going back decades. The list of shows that came out of Hanna-Barbera reads like a guide to American childhood across 4 different decades. The Flintstones, The Jetsons, Scooby-Doo, Yogi Bear, Top Cat, Johnny Quest. The studio had been making cartoons that shaped the landscape of American children's entertainment for 35 years by the time McFarlane arrived. At Hanna-Barbera, McFarlane worked on several shows that were running in that mid-90s period. He worked on Johnny Bravo, a show about a muscular, dim-witted man with an enormous blonde pompadour who was constantly pursuing women and being rejected by them, structured around the comedy of his obliviousness to his own absurdity. He worked on Cow and Chicken, which was a show about a cow and a chicken who were full siblings, raised by parents who were depicted only from the waist down, a premise the show never explained or questioned, using the inexplicable family structure as the foundation for increasingly surreal plots. He worked on Dexter's Laboratory, which was about a small boy genius with an enormous secret laboratory hidden behind his bedroom bookshelf, who spent every episode attempting brilliant scientific experiments that were derailed by his relentlessly cheerful and oblivious older sister Dee Dee. These were good shows. They were genuinely creative, particularly Dexter's Laboratory, which had a specific visual wit and a warm understanding of sibling dynamics that elevated it well above the standard of Saturday morning programming. Working on them taught McFarlane the technical grammar of animated television production, how a show is built, how episodes are structured, how the collaboration between writers and animators and voice performers actually functions in a working studio environment. But while he was doing this work, he was also doing something else. He was making his own films. Not for anyone else, not as a pitch or a demonstration, just as an expression of something he wanted to express. He made 2 short animated films during this period. The first was called The Life of Larry. The second was called Larry and Steve. Larry was a large man. Heavy, cheerful, good-natured in a thoroughgoing way that did not require much introspection. He was the kind of person who could walk into a difficult situation and walk back out of it with a broad smile because he had not quite understood that the situation was difficult. He meant well. He always meant well. He was just not equipped with the tools to translate his good intentions into outcomes that were actually good. Steve was Larry's dog. Steve could talk. Steve was perceptive where Larry was oblivious, articulate where Larry was fumbling, capable of understanding the full context of every situation Larry blundered into and largely powerless to prevent any of it. Steve watched Larry navigate his life with a combination of affection and resigned amusement. He could not look away. He could not leave. He would not have wanted to. If you have ever watched a single episode of Family Guy, you already know what you are looking at when you watch these shorts. Larry is Peter Griffin, before the name, before Quahog, before the Pawtucket Patriot Ale and the Clam Bar, and the endless parade of celebrity cameos. Steve is Brian Griffin, before the martinis and the novel and the AA meetings that never quite stuck. The essential dynamic, the lovable fool and the talking dog who was smarter than everyone and knew it, was present and fully formed in these 2 short films that McFarlane made in his own time in the mid-1990s. He took this material, expanded it, built a family around the central relationship, created a wife and children and a neighborhood, placed the whole thing in a fictional Rhode Island town called Quahog, and pitched it to Fox Broadcasting in the spring of 1998. He was 24 years old when he developed the pitch. He was 25 when he delivered it. He had been working in the industry for roughly 3 years. Fox gave him the order. The pilot was produced quickly. Within months, there was a finished episode. And on the 31st of January 1999, Family Guy made its debut on Fox in the time slot immediately following Super Bowl 23. Let us pause on that placement for a moment, because it is genuinely remarkable. Super Bowl 23 was the game between the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons. Denver won decisively. The game itself was not particularly close, which meant that by the end of the 4th quarter, the audience watching at home was still present, but the tension that might have kept people from changing the channel had largely dissipated. And then, into that slot, with that enormous captive audience, Fox placed a brand new animated sitcom from a first-time television creator. The first episode of Family Guy was watched by 22 million people. In a contemporary streaming landscape where 10 million viewers for a debut episode is considered an outstanding result, 22 million sounds almost impossibly large. In 1999, it was enormous, even by the standards of a broadcast network, which routinely drew numbers that streaming platforms cannot match because broadcast television was simply how most Americans consumed video content. 22 million people watched a 25-year-old's animated sitcom on its first night of existence. The world was introduced to the Griffins. Peter, the patriarch, was a large man who worked at a paternalistic toy factory and spent his leisure hours at a bar called the Drunken Clam with his three best friends, Quagmire, the ladies' man neighbor whose cheerful sexual adventurism would become more complicated to assess with each passing year, Cleveland, the soft-spoken neighbor who spoke slowly and thoughtfully, and who would eventually spin off into his own series, and Joe Swanson, the police officer who used a wheelchair and whose disability the show used variously as a source of comedy, a source of genuine character exploration, and occasionally a source of something that sat uncomfortably between the two. Lois was Peter's wife. She had grown up wealthy, her father being the wealthy industrialist Carter Pewterschmidt, a man who had never approved of his daughter's marriage to a man like Peter, and who expressed this disapproval in the particular way that very rich men express disapproval, which is through condescension and the occasional deliberate withholding of financial support. Lois had chosen her life anyway. She loved Peter. It was never quite clear, in the early seasons, exactly why, but the show did not require you to fully understand it, only to accept it as the load-bearing fact of the Griffin family's existence. Meg was the oldest child. 17 at the start, a teenager navigating high school at James Woods Regional High School, a school named for the actor James Woods, who was a recurring character on the show for several seasons before a public falling out between him and MacFarlane made the references stop. Meg was unpopular. She was not the protagonist of the show, and she was not meant to be, and in the early seasons her unpopularity was background detail rather than the consistent target it would become. She had a crush on a boy. She had a friend or two. She had a mother who sometimes paid attention to her, and a father who mostly did not. She existed at the edges of the Griffin family's chaos, mostly trying to find a way to be a normal teenager while her family made normal teenage life implausible. Chris was the son, 15 at the start, soft-natured and somewhat scattered, a kid who occupied the middle of the Griffin family's birth order with the benign confusion of someone who has not yet quite figured out the shape of his own personality. Chris was not ambitious. He was not unkind. He had a specific running subplot, introduced early and occasionally revisited, about a tiny man who lived in his closet and gave him sinister advice. The show never quite decided how literally to take this. The tiny man appeared. People other than Chris sometimes saw him. It was left, like many things in early Family Guy, productively ambiguous. Stewie was the infant, and Stewie requires his own paragraph, because Stewie was the element of the show that most fully expressed what made the early Family Guy strange and specific and unlike anything that was on television at the time. Stewie Griffin was approximately 12 months old. He spoke in a voice modeled on the theatrical diction of Rex Harrison, precise and slightly Edwardian, the kind of voice you associate with someone who wears ascots unironically. He had an active and detailed inner life. He had constructed, in the house that he shared with his family, a working ray gun and several other weapons of significant destructive capability. His stated primary goal in the early seasons was world domination, which he pursued with genuine strategic seriousness. His secondary stated goal was the elimination of Lois, a mother he experienced as a constant source of indignity and constraint, whom he occasionally addressed directly as woman, and whose destruction he plotted with elaborate care between diaper changes. The joke, and it was a well-constructed joke, was that this was an infant who required naps and formula and the assistance of adults for basic physical mobility, but who was simultaneously planning the overthrow of the world's governments. The incongruity was funny in a specific and durable way. The early Stewie episodes are genuinely creative, finding new angles on the joke, new ways to press the contrast between the obvious helplessness of infancy and the grandiose menace of the character's interior life. And then there was Brian. Brian was the dog. Brian walked on two legs. He drank martinis. He smoked occasionally. He had opinions about literature and politics and art. He was working on a novel, perpetually, across the entire run of the show, a novel that never quite got finished. He had attended Brown University, or at least he claimed to have done something there that counted as attendance. He was, within the world of the show, fully accepted as a functioning adult member of the household, using his status as a pet as a kind of social cover while living the life of a sophisticated bachelor with a drinking problem and a string of unsuccessful relationships. Brian was where the show put most of its intellectual ambition. He was the voice of reason when the show needed one. He was the one who would occasionally step back from the chaos and say something true about what was happening. In the early seasons, this function was deployed with some care. Brian's reasonableness was not absolute. He had his own blind spots, his own areas of delusion, his own capacity for self-congratulation that the show was willing to puncture. He was not a purely reliable narrator, but he was the closest thing the show had to a moral anchor in the early years. The show was immediately a hit. After the enormous Super Bowl debut, the ratings settled at a still significant level through the first season, and Fox ordered more. What the network had was a comedy that was genuinely funny in ways that were novel for American network television. A show with a specific voice and a specific sensibility that audiences had not encountered in quite that form before. What makes the early seasons of Family Guy worth dwelling on, beyond the historical interest of seeing the show before it became what it became, is the presence of genuine warmth. This is the element of the show that is easiest to lose sight of when you spend time with the controversy and the darkness that came later. But it was there. It was real. Peter loved Lois. The show was not pretending. He was incapable and clumsy and frequently a disaster as a partner and parent. But when it mattered, when the episode came to its end and some version of a reckoning was required, Peter would say something honest about his wife that was unmistakably genuine. The family held together not because the show required it, but because the writers wanted it to. Lois and Peter had a real marriage, in the comedic and compressed sense that a sitcom marriage can be real. And perhaps most importantly, Meg was a person in the early seasons. She had storylines. She had feelings that the show took seriously, in the limited sense that any character's feelings are taken seriously in a 22-minute comedy. She had a relationship with her parents that was recognizable as something like a real teenage relationship with real parents. She wanted their attention. She occasionally got it. She was embarrassed by them in the way that teenagers are embarrassed by parents. The idea that she was the family's punching bag, the designated object of mockery and dismissal, had not yet calcified into the show's settled relationship with the character. The first 3 seasons ran from 1999 to 2002. Across those 3 seasons, the show became something significant. It found its audience, it refined its voice, and it produced a body of work that, even now, holds up as creative and frequently very funny television. The cutaways were specific and well-constructed. The character dynamics were clear and consistently maintained. The show knew what it was, and then Fox canceled it. In 2002, after 3 seasons and a viewer ratings slide that the network found insufficient, Fox canceled Family Guy. The show ended without a proper finale, without resolution, without the kind of formal goodbye that a show with this kind of following might have expected. It simply stopped. What happened next is one of the more genuinely unusual chapters in American television history. Family Guy did not stay dead. Its DVD sales in the period immediately following cancellation were extraordinary. The show found an audience through home video and through Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network, which picked up the canceled episodes and ran them to strong ratings in a demographic that Fox had perhaps not fully appreciated it had been capturing. Young adult men, 18 to 34, the demographic that advertisers are most interested in reaching, were watching Family Guy on Adult Swim in numbers that made Fox pay attention. In 2005, 3 years after cancellation, Fox brought Family Guy back. It was, at the time, the most successful revival of a canceled American television series that anyone could remember. The show returned in the same time slot on the same network, with the same cast and the same creator, and the audience was waiting. But something had shifted. The revival-era Family Guy was not the same show as the pre-cancellation Family Guy. The differences were subtle at first. and they accumulated across seasons 4, 5, and 6 into something that the critics who had appreciated the early show began to notice and write about. The warmth had cooled, the character consistency had loosened. Peter's stupidity, which had been a source of comedy in the early seasons because it was bounded, because there was a recognizable human being underneath it, became more extreme, more absolute. His cruelty to Meg, which had been occasional in the early seasons, became systematic. The cutaways became more frequent and less specifically constructed, more often random and disconnected, present not because they were the funniest thing for this particular moment, but because the show had trained its audience to expect them at regular intervals. This is the version of the show that produced most of the moments we are going to discuss tonight. The revival-era Family Guy, running from 2005 through the present, is where the controversies cluster, where the bans and the protests and the advocacy group statements and the pulled episodes live. The early show was not innocent of controversy. We will discuss the first banned episode in the next section, but the overwhelming majority of the moments that made Family Guy nationally controversial came from the version of the show that returned in 2005 and kept going. Why did the show change? Several things probably contributed. The break itself, the 3 years during which the writers dispersed, and the show had to be rebuilt rather than simply continued. The awareness of the show's cultural position, which was different in 2005 than it had been in 1999. A first-time showrunner discovers he has created an institution and must figure out what to do with that knowledge. The influence of the DVD viewing habits that had saved the show, the specific audience that had kept it alive by watching it repeatedly in ways that the original broadcast audience had not, an audience that may have been drawn partly to the show's more provocative elements, and whose taste the revival-era show was trying to serve. And perhaps simply the drift that happens to any long-running creative project, the gradual erosion of the original intentions under the pressure of producing 22 episodes a year, year after year, for a network that wanted the show to stay popular and a creator who had many other things going on in his professional life. Whatever the cause, the change was real, and the consequences of that change are the subject of everything that follows. If you have been watching from the beginning, now is a good time to let your eyes close if they have not already. You have learned something tonight about how the show started and who made it and what it was before it became what it became. The rest of the story is waiting whenever you are ready. Before we go further, a small request. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. It is one of the things that makes these long videos feel less solitary, knowing that there are people in different time zones, different cities, different circumstances, all in the same quiet space at the same time. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do. It is a small thing that makes a real difference to whether this kind of content keeps existing. Okay, let us continue. Part 2. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein and the First Time Fox Said No. The first banned episode of Family Guy was produced in the year 2000, during the show's 3rd season, and it was kept off the air for more than 3 years. The episode is called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The title is a reference to the Disney song When You Wish Upon a Star, from the 1940 animated film Pinocchio, one of the most recognizable pieces of American children's music in the 20th century. A song so thoroughly embedded in the cultural identity of the Disney brand that the studio still uses it as the musical accompaniment to its logo. The episode's title was the first signal that what was coming would require careful consideration of what it was actually doing. The plot of the episode, summarized as plainly as possible, goes like this. Peter Griffin has money problems. This is not unusual for Peter Griffin. Managing money requires a certain level of executive function and forward planning that Peter does not have access to in any consistent way. In this episode, however, the money problems are specifically and directly connected to his failure to have the thing that, according to the episode, Jewish men reliably possess, which is a natural aptitude for financial management. Peter, watching his family's savings evaporate through a series of poor decisions, becomes convinced that what he needs is a Jewish accountant. He meets a man named Max Weinstein, who is Jewish, who is good with money, and who befriends Peter and helps him sort out his financial situation. Peter becomes fascinated by Max and by his perception of Jewish culture more broadly. He becomes so enthusiastic about what he perceives as the advantages of being Jewish that he decides he wants Chris to convert to Judaism, enrolling him in conversion classes without Lois's knowledge or consent. The centerpiece of the episode, the thing that made Fox nervous enough to pull it from the schedule, was a song. Peter sings a song called I Need a Jew. The song is performed in the style of the Jiminy Cricket musical numbers from Pinocchio, in deliberate imitation of the Disney musical tradition the episode's title was already referencing. The lyrics are a list of the stereotypes Peter associates with Jewish men, primarily the stereotype that Jewish men are exceptionally good with money and financial planning. The question of whether this song is anti-Semitic, whether the episode as a whole is anti-Semitic, is one that critics and viewers have been debating since the episode finally aired. Seth MacFarlane is on the record saying that the episode was never intended as an endorsement of anti-Semitic stereotypes. The episode, he has argued, is a satire of Peter's ignorance. It is Peter who holds these stereotypes. The show is laughing at Peter, not endorsing what Peter believes. Max Weinstein is portrayed as a genuine and complete human being. The joke is supposed to be on Peter. This argument is coherent as far as it goes. The show does not present Peter's stereotypes as accurate. Max Weinstein is not a cartoon. He has a personality and a perspective and a dignity that the episode respects. The comedy of Peter's obsession is framed as the comedy of Peter's obliviousness, which is the framing the show used for most of Peter's obsessions. You are supposed to find Peter's enthusiasm for Jewish stereotypes funny in the way you find all of Peter's enthusiasms funny, because Peter is a fool and his enthusiasms are always slightly off target and slightly too much. The counter-argument is that a song listing anti-Semitic stereotypes is a song listing anti-Semitic stereotypes regardless of the fictional character who is singing it. That the frame of satire does not fully contain the content being satirized. That when you write a catchy melody and have a likable character sing a list of ethnic stereotypes, the delivery system you have chosen is potentially more powerful than the satirical disclaimer surrounding it. That the entertainment and the message are not as cleanly separable as the creator would like. Fox Broadcasting agreed, essentially, with the counter-argument, and they kept the episode off the air. The episode did not simply sit in a vault. It was eventually broadcast on Adult Swim in November of 2003, more than 3 years after it was produced. Adult Swim aired it without the kind of promotional fanfare that would have surrounded a regular Fox broadcast, but it aired. The following year, Fox put it in their regular rotation, and it aired on the network in December of 2004. So it was not permanently banned. It was delayed, held back, kept off the primetime Fox schedule for 3 years, and then eventually allowed to air, and it has aired many times since. It is on the DVD collections. It has been watched millions of times. The episode that Fox deemed too risky to air in 2000 is now simply part of the Family Guy catalog. But the story does not end with the episode airing. In 2007, a music publishing company called Bourne Company filed a lawsuit against 20th Century Fox Film Corporation and various other defendants connected to Family Guy. The lawsuit alleged copyright infringement. The claim was that the I Need a Jew song, which was performed in deliberate imitation of the Jiminy Cricket song When You Wish Upon a Star, crossed from permissible parody into copyright infringement. Copyright law in the United States recognizes a doctrine called fair use, which is a set of factors that courts weigh when determining whether an otherwise infringing use of copyrighted material is permitted by law. One of the clearest applications of fair use is parody. A parody, legally defined, is a work that uses elements of an existing copyrighted work to comment on or critique that original work. The imitation has to be targeting the original, making it the subject of the commentary, not just borrowing the original style to make a joke about something else entirely. Bourne Company argued that I Need a Jew was not a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star in the legally cognizable sense. It was, they contended, a song that borrowed the tune and style of the Disney classic to make a joke that had nothing to do with When You Wish Upon a Star. The original song was not the target of the commentary. It was just a convenient musical vehicle. That, Bourne argued, was infringement rather than parody. Fox and the Family Guy producers argued that the song was clearly a parody. The use of the Jiminy Cricket-style musical form was intentional, they said, and was itself part of the joke, part of the satirical structure. The episode was titled, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, The connection to the Disney source material was not coincidental or decorative. It was the premise. The case went to the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. In 2009, the court ruled in favor of Fox and the Family Guy producers. The court found that the song was a parody in the legally protected sense. The imitation of the Disney musical style was integral to the episode's satirical commentary. Bourne Company's claim was dismissed. This was a significant victory for the show, and more broadly for the principle that animated comedies have broad latitude to parody existing cultural and entertainment material. The ruling was cited in subsequent legal discussions of parody and fair use in the context of contemporary media. It became, in a small but real way, part of the legal landscape of American entertainment copyright. The episode itself remains complicated. It was not the last time Family Guy would engage with Jewish identity and Jewish stereotypes. The show returned to this territory periodically across subsequent seasons, sometimes with more success than others, sometimes with the clear satirical frame intact and sometimes without it. The recurring character Mort Goldman, the Griffin's pharmacist neighbor, was a Jewish man whose portrayal was heavily based on nervous, neurotic, money-conscious stereotypes that the show did not always subject to the same level of satirical framing that it applied in the Weinstein episode. The Weinstein episode is also notable for being the first time Fox formally intervened in the show's content in a way that kept an episode off the air. This established a pattern. Fox would pull other Family Guy episodes over the years for other reasons, in other circumstances. The network was not a passive distributor. It made judgments. It had limits. And those limits, their location and their consistency, are part of the story of what Family Guy was allowed to be and what it was not. The episode also introduced a question that runs through everything else we are going to discuss tonight. What is the difference between a cartoon making a joke about a stereotype and a cartoon endorsing that stereotype? What is the relationship between the satirical frame and the actual content of the thing being satirized? When you put a stereotype in the mouth of a character who is portrayed as a fool, have you neutralized the stereotype or have you just given yourself permission to say it out loud? There are no clean answers to these questions. They are the questions that critics of the show have been asking for more than 2 decades. They are the questions that defenders of the show have been answering in various ways for just as long. They will come up again and again as we go through the episodes that follow. The Weinstein episode is where they were first posed in a way that had real consequences for the show's broadcast schedule. The episode is genuinely funny in places. That is worth saying directly, because the controversy around it can sometimes obscure the fact that the comedic craft is present, that there are real jokes here and not just provocations looking for reactions. Max Weinstein is a well-drawn character. Peter's enthusiasm, as always, is performed with a specific kind of cheerful conviction that is difficult not to laugh at. The episode has a warmth to it, the warmth of the early show, that the revival-era episodes often lacked, but it also has the song, and the song is what it is. And you can construct an argument about satirical framing and authorial intention and the distinction between endorsing a stereotype and depicting a character who holds a stereotype. And that argument has real merit, and it is not dishonest. And you can also say that a catchy song listing anti-Semitic stereotypes is a catchy song listing anti-Semitic stereotypes, and that the disclaimer in the frame does not fully undo what the song itself is doing in the listener's ear. And that argument also has merit. The episode sits in that space. It has lived there for more than 20 years. It will probably keep living there. Part 3, The Revival Seasons and the Drift. When Family Guy returned in 2005, after its 3 years of cancellation, the show was aware of its own mythology in a way that the original run had never been. A show in its first year does not know what it is yet. A show in its 5th year knows exactly what it is, or at least it knows what its audience has come to expect from it. The revival-era Family Guy had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The 4th season premiered in May of 2005 with a 2-part episode called North by North Quahog, a title borrowing from the Hitchcock film North by Northwest. It was a celebratory return. The audience was enthusiastic. The ratings were strong. The show was back and everyone involved seemed pleased about it. But underneath the celebration, something was already different. The clearest way to describe the drift that happens across seasons 4 through 7 is to talk about Peter Griffin's intelligence, or, more precisely, his capacity for basic human empathy and situational awareness. In the first 3 seasons, Peter was stupid. This is not a cruel observation, it is a factual description of the character as written. He was a man with limited intellectual capacity who made decisions based on incomplete information and flawed reasoning. But his stupidity had a shape. It had borders. There were things he understood, things he cared about, relationships he maintained with genuine feeling. In the revival seasons, the character's stupidity began to expand in ways that changed its fundamental nature. The stupidity became more extreme, more absolute, more cartoonish. The things Peter was incapable of understanding grew to include things that any functioning adult would understand, including, increasingly, the basic welfare of the people he supposedly loved. This expansion of Peter's incapacity served a specific comedic purpose. It opened up new territory for jokes. If Peter does not understand that certain things cause pain, then Peter can be shown causing pain without the show having to account for his moral responsibility in causing it. If Peter does not quite know that his daughter has feelings, then Peter can treat his daughter as an object of mockery without the show having to commit to that treatment being wrong. The relationship with Meg is the clearest and most developed expression of this drift. We will spend an entire section on Meg later in this video because it deserves that space. But even in the early revival seasons, the pattern was forming. Meg was becoming less of a character and more of a target. The jokes about her were becoming more systematic. The show was testing how much it could dismiss her without the audience turning on the show itself. The cutaways also changed across these seasons. The early cutaways were specific constructions. Someone had asked what would be funniest here and had written something for exactly this moment. By the middle revival seasons, the cutaways had become more standardized. The setup was always the same. Peter or another character would say, "This reminds me of the time," and then the scene would cut. But the cutaway that followed had become less tied to what preceded it. The connection between the setup and the cutaway became more attenuated, more arbitrary, until in some later episodes it was essentially non-existent, a formal gesture toward a structure that the show had trained audiences to accept, even when it no longer carried the comedic weight it had originally been built to carry. The political and cultural comedy also shifted. The early show had opinions but held them lightly, deployed them in service of jokes rather than using jokes in service of opinions. The revival-era show became more directly editorial, more willing to spend extended time on political commentary that was less interested in being funny than in being pointed. This is not inherently wrong in a comedy. South Park had built an entire sensibility on exactly this approach. But Family Guy was less consistent in its political commitments than South Park, less systematic, more likely to say something on one side of a cultural debate in one episode, and something that contradicted it in another. The show's politics were the politics of whatever the writer's room found irritating on any given week, rather than a settled perspective on anything. The characters who populated the world of Quahog began to harden into types. Quagmire, who in the early seasons was a cheerfully amoral womanizer whose excesses were kept at a comedic distance by the speed and lightness of the jokes around them, became in the revival seasons a more explicit figure. The show lingered more on his pursuit of women. The humor around him became more directly sexual in ways that the early show had generally avoided. The discomfort that had always been present around Quagmire's character, the awareness that his behavior toward women, treated as comedy in the early show, described things that were not actually funny in any real-world context, became harder to ignore as the show's approach to him became more enthusiastic. Joe Swanson's disability, which in the early seasons had been handled with an intermittent awkwardness that at least suggested the show knew it was on uncertain ground, became in the revival seasons a more regular source of physical comedy. There is an ongoing debate about how disability is portrayed in animated comedies, a debate that involves real disagreements about who gets to make what kinds of jokes and what the relationship is between comedic exaggeration and genuine dehumanization. Family Guy occupied an uncomfortable position in that debate across the revival seasons, not because it was uniquely egregious, but because it was never quite consistent enough in its approach to build a coherent argument for what it was doing and why. Cleveland was in many ways the steadiest character through this period. His gentle, measured demeanor made him somewhat resistant to the extremes the show was exploring elsewhere. He was the one member of the core friend group who could be around Peter, and remain recognizably decent. The Cleveland Show, which spun him off into his own series from 2009 to 2013, gave him space to develop in ways the ensemble format of Family Guy had never quite allowed. The spin-off was not a particularly successful one, and it ended after 4 seasons, but it was an acknowledgement that Cleveland had accumulated enough character to sustain his own narrative. Stewie's character underwent perhaps the most significant transformation across the revival seasons. The original Stewie was a genuine threat. He had a ray gun. He used it. His plans for world domination were specific, detailed, and, within the internal logic of the show, plausible. He was dangerous in a comedic way that required the show to keep taking him seriously as a comedic premise. The revival-era Stewie became gradually softer. The plans for global domination receded. The ray gun stayed, but it was deployed with less frequency and less weight. What filled the space that the menace had occupied was a different comedic thread entirely, a more explicitly comedic engagement with questions about Stewie's sexuality and gender identity. The show made Stewie's possible homosexuality a running joke, handled with varying degrees of care across different episodes, sometimes light and genuinely funny, sometimes more stereotypical in ways that advocacy organizations noted in their regular assessments of the show's content. Brian's character drifted in a direction we will discuss more fully in a later section. The short version is that the show's relationship with Brian became more complicated as the revival-era writers tried to use him as a satirical target rather than simply as a moral anchor, and the results were uneven. Brian at his best was the show's conscience, the character who could hold up a mirror to the other characters' worst impulses. Brian, at his worst in the revival seasons, was a vehicle for the show's own worst impulses, a character who did genuinely harmful things and whose harm the show sometimes acknowledged and sometimes seemed not to notice. Across seasons 4 through 7, from 2005 to 2009, all of these changes accumulated. The show was still frequently very funny. The revival-era Family Guy produced genuinely brilliant individual moments, brilliant individual episodes, performances from its voice cast that were as sharp as anything in the early run. The problems were not constant or absolute, but they were consistent in a way that added up to something, and that something is the subject of everything that comes after. The drift across these seasons is what made the subsequent controversies possible. A show that had maintained the warmth and the character consistency of the early run would not have made the episode about domestic violence. It would not have made the choices around Meg that it made. The drift was the condition that enabled what followed. Part 4. The Meg Problem: A Decade of Cruelty. Meg Griffin is the oldest child of Peter and Lois Griffin. She is 17 years old at the start of the series. She attends James Woods Regional High School in Quahog, Rhode Island. She wants to be liked. She wants to belong. She has a reasonably accurate understanding of her own situation, which is that she does not belong, at least not in the ways she would like to. She is not brilliant or beautiful in the ways that make high school navigable. She is earnest in a context that punishes earnestness. She tries in a context that rewards a kind of cool disengagement she does not have access to. She is, in other words, a recognizable human being at a recognizable stage of human development, doing her best with limited resources and imperfect equipment. In the first 3 seasons, Meg was treated with something approaching the respect that recognizable human beings deserve. She had episodes built around her. She had a storyline about a crush that felt like a real teenage crush. She had a relationship with her parents that was frustrating and imperfect and recognizably real. She was not the show's most interesting character, but she was a character with interior life and relationships and something like a future that the show occasionally suggested. What happened across the revival seasons was gradual and systematic and, when you look at it collected, genuinely difficult to watch as anything other than what it is. Meg became the show's designated target, the character that everyone was allowed to be cruel to, the punching bag, the object of dismissal and contempt from the other characters, and the object of mockery from the show itself, and the source of a joke about her own undesirability that repeated with greater frequency and greater viciousness as the seasons progressed. Peter, across the revival seasons, became openly contemptuous of Meg in ways that the early show had not permitted. He forgot her name. He forgot that she existed. He tried, in one episode, to give her away to another family. He participated enthusiastically in the game, adopted by the show as a regular feature, of treating her as less than human, as an annoyance at best and a liability at worst. There is an episode in which Peter, trying to demonstrate something to Chris, treats Meg as an object in a way that the show frames as Peter being casually unaware of her humanity, rather than as something that requires acknowledgement or consequence. Lois's treatment of Meg is, in some ways, more disturbing than Peter's, precisely because Lois is the parent who is supposed to be the reasonable one. Peter is a fool. Peter's failures of care and attention, while they accumulate into something troubling, exist within the character context of a man who is comprehensively incapable in most areas of his life. Lois, however, is presented as the competent parent, the one who understands the family and manages its chaos and loves her children with some measure of deliberateness and awareness. And Lois, in the revival seasons, is casually cruel to Meg in ways that the show does not always notice. There is an episode in which Lois, asked to say something nice about Meg, responds with a comment that is as close to nothing as something can be. There are episodes in which Lois dismisses Meg's suffering in ways that, if you tried to describe them in plain terms without the comedic context, would sound like accounts of genuinely neglectful parenting. The show frames these moments as character comedy. Lois is not a bad mother. The show does not think it is depicting a bad mother. But the accumulation of moments in which Lois fails Meg, and the absence of any sustained examination of what that failure means, creates an impression that the show does not fully intend and does not fully control. The peers at school are perhaps the most thorough expression of the Meg problem. Meg is not simply unpopular. She is actively and deliberately excluded, mocked, and dismissed by every social category she tries to join. The jocks mock her. The popular girls mock her. The nerds, who might be expected to be sympathetic, are depicted as too concerned with their own social survival to extend any real welcome. The teachers are indifferent. The school itself is a place in which Meg's existence is treated as a minor administrative nuisance by everyone who has the misfortune of encountering it. The show produces, across 15 or more seasons of this treatment, a portrait of a young woman whose experience of the world is one of unrelenting rejection from every direction. And the show wants you to find this funny. The comedy is predicated on the rejection being absolute, on there being no exit, on the cruelty being total. The funniness, such as it is, depends on Meg never getting a break. A break would end the joke. This is where the Meg problem gets philosophically interesting, if philosophically is the right word for what is happening here. Comedy requires surprise, subversion, something unexpected. A character who is always rejected in the same way by the same people to the same degree is not being used for comedy. She is being used as something else. She is a stable fixture of misery around which other comedic elements can organize. She is background suffering. Her unhappiness is not the punchline. It is the backdrop against which other punchlines occur. There is an episode called Steroids from the 8th season, in which Chris becomes briefly popular and then has to choose between his popularity and his integrity. The episode is ostensibly about Chris, but it requires Meg's misery as a structural element. Chris's popularity is measured against a baseline of what the social hierarchy looks like when it is functioning normally, and Meg's permanent position at the bottom of that hierarchy is part of what establishes the baseline. The episode works, to the extent that it works, partly because Meg's wretchedness is a given, something the audience can take for granted without requiring setup. Season 8 contains an episode called Peter's Daughter, in which Peter, after Meg nearly drowns and spends time in a coma, becomes overprotective of her and prevents her from pursuing a relationship with a medical student named Michael. The episode has a moment of genuine connection between Peter and Meg, a brief acknowledgement that Peter cares about his daughter in ways he has difficulty expressing. And then it ends in a way that undermines even that brief warmth. When Peter discovers that Michael has gotten Meg pregnant, and then, learning of Peter's intentions, has fled rather than face Peter's wrath, Peter's response is not to comfort his daughter. It is not to acknowledge that she has been abandoned by someone she loved. It is to say he should have seen this coming, to frame Meg's abandonment as predictable given who Meg is, which is to say, to deliver the show's judgment that Meg deserved to be left. The episode that addresses this pattern most directly is Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10, which we will discuss in detail later. For now, it is enough to say that the pattern is real, documented across seasons, and constitutes one of the most sustained explorations in American animated comedy of what it looks like when a creative work decides to make a character's suffering a permanent comedic resource without ever examining what that decision means or costs. Meg is voiced by Mila Kunis, who has been with the show since the second episode of the first season. The original voice was done by Lacey Chabert for the first season before Kunis took over. Kunis has spoken in interviews about the experience of voicing a character who is treated the way Meg is treated, and she has done so with the kind of pragmatic acceptance that comes from spending 20 years on a show where the treatment of your character is simply a settled fact. She has acknowledged that she has made peace with it, that she understands what the joke is, even if she might have preferred a different joke. What Meg deserved, and what the show occasionally came close to giving her before pulling back, was the thing that the final scene of Seahorse Seashell Party briefly suggests and then immediately takes away. We will get to that. For now, just let the accumulation of it sit with you. The years of it, the weight of a character whose function in a story was primarily to absorb the cruelties that the story needed to deploy somewhere. She is still on the show. As of this recording, Family Guy is still running, and Meg Griffin is still a character in it. Her situation has not fundamentally changed. The joke, if that is what it is still running. Part 5. Seahorse Seashell Party, The Hurricane and the Speech. Season 10 of Family Guy premiered in September of 2011. The second episode of that season, which aired on the 2nd of October 2011, is called Seahorse Seashell Party. It was written during a period when the show was receiving sustained critical attention for its treatment of Meg, and there is, inside the episode, some evidence that the writers were aware of that attention and were attempting to respond to it. The episode's premise is a hurricane. A major storm is bearing down on Quahog, and the Griffin family is confined to the house while it passes. Simultaneously, Brian has gotten into a supply of hallucinogenic mushrooms and spends most of the episode in a chemically altered state that allows the show to deploy visual humor around his distorted perception. Stewie, presented with the opportunity that a housebound sibling offers, spends the episode tormenting Meg in various ways. But the center of the episode, the element that has given it a specific place in the show's history and the reason critics and viewers have returned to it repeatedly, is what happens when Meg has enough. For most of the episode's runtime, Meg absorbs. This is her default mode, her settled function in the Griffin household. She absorbs the taunts from Stewie. She absorbs the indifference from Peter. She absorbs the peripheral quality of her mother's attention. She absorbs and does not respond, because she has learned, over the accumulated years of the show's treatment of her, that responding does not change anything. But the hurricane creates a particular kind of pressure. Being confined in a small space with the people who are consistently cruel to you, when there is nowhere to go and no social distance to establish, when the weather itself has stripped away the ordinary management strategies, is a different experience from the daily endurance of a school day or a dinner table. The confinement is the condition. And in this particular confinement, Meg reaches a point where the accumulated weight of everything she has absorbed is more than she can manage silently. She says something. The speech that Meg delivers in Seahorse Seashell Party is, for the amount of screen time it occupies, one of the most compressed and precise pieces of character writing in the show's long history. She does not shout. She does not break down. She speaks clearly and directly, in a voice that carries the kind of steadiness that comes not from composure but from having reached a place beyond the point where composure matters anymore. She tells her parents what they have done. She describes, specifically, the ways in which Peter's dismissal of her has shaped her experience of herself, the ways in which a father's contempt becomes the lens through which a daughter understands her own worth. She describes what it means to have a mother who sees and does not intervene, who is capable of care but deploys it elsewhere, who maintains the household's peace at the cost of one of its members. She describes Stewie's cruelty not as sibling mischief but as something more systematic, something enabled and implicitly endorsed by the family structure around it. The speech is surprising. It is surprising because it says true things. It is surprising because the show has rarely, in 20 minutes of weekly comedy, made space for Meg to be the one who names what is happening to her. It is surprising because it treats Meg as someone capable of articulacy and insight, which is something the show has systematically refused to do for years, while simultaneously having her available as a receptacle for everyone else's cruelty. The family listens. This is also surprising. Peter and Lois do not dismiss the speech. They do not laugh at it or interrupt it or immediately change the subject. The show gives Meg's words the space to land, and they land, and the family responds to them as if they were the words of a person whose perspective matters. And then the episode takes it away. After the speech, after Peter and Lois and even Stewie have something that looks like a reckoning with what Meg has said, the episode walks it back. Meg comes to a realization, or is depicted as coming to a realization, that her role in the family is actually important, that she is the lightning rod, that the dysfunction of the Griffin family needs somewhere to go, and that she serves a function by being the place it goes. That without Meg absorbing the family's cruelty and keeping it inside the family system, the family would fall apart. That she is, in a way the show has never framed before and does not fully commit to here, structurally necessary. This is philosophically coherent as a family systems insight. In real family therapy, the concept of the identified patient, the family member who carries the dysfunction for the system, is a real and documented phenomenon. Families do sometimes maintain themselves by designating one member as the carrier of the collective pathology, and that member, in removing themselves from that role, can create a crisis that destabilizes everyone else. But the show uses this insight not to liberate Meg but to lock her back in place. The realization she comes to is not the beginning of something different. It is the justification for the status quo. She understands now why she has to keep absorbing. She has been shown the logic of her own imprisonment, and she accepts it. The episode ends with things largely as they were before the speech. The speech is real. It happened. It is in the episode, archived and accessible, and available for anyone who wants to see it. But the show builds in the mechanism of its own neutralization. The moment of genuine confrontation and genuine naming, the moment where Meg was briefly permitted to be right about what had been done to her, is used to justify the continuation of the thing she was right about. Critics who discussed this episode at the time, and in subsequent years, have generally agreed on the structure of what it is doing. The show acknowledges the problem and then uses that acknowledgement to protect the problem from having to change. It is a specific and somewhat sophisticated move, and it is not unique to Family Guy. There is a long history of comedies that create a moment of apparent self-awareness about their own problematic elements, and then use that self-awareness as a license to continue doing the problematic thing. The episode received mixed reviews upon airing. The AV Club, which was covering Family Guy episode by episode at this point in the show's run, gave it a D+, noting that the Meg speech was a genuinely moving moment that the episode immediately undermined. The review called the resolution a cheat. That is the word that appears in multiple contemporary assessments of the episode. Cheat. The show showed you something real and then told you to put it back where it was. Seahorse Seashell Party is one of the episodes that Family Guy viewers reference most often when they are trying to explain their complicated relationship with the show, the specific feeling of watching a program that clearly has the capacity to do something true and keeps choosing not to. The capacity is demonstrated right there in the speech. The choice is demonstrated in everything that comes after it. Part 6. Quagmire's Dad and the 30-Second Vomit. The episode is called Quagmire's Dad. It is the 18th episode of the 8th season. It aired on the 9th of May 2010, and it is one of the most contested episodes in the show's history. Contested in a way that involves genuine disagreement among people who are not simply arguing from different taste preferences, but from different understandings of what representation means and what harm looks like when it is wearing the costume of comedy. The premise of the episode is that Glenn Quagmire's father, a naval officer named Dan Quagmire, who has appeared in previous episodes as a gruff and traditionally masculine retired military man, comes to visit and announces that he has, after a lifetime of living in a way that did not reflect who he actually was, decided to undergo gender-confirming surgery and transition to a woman named Ida. Quagmire's reaction is the comedic and emotional center of the episode. He is devastated. He does not know how to process this. He responds to his father's transition with denial and grief and anger in a progression that the episode treats with more sincerity than most people who remember the episode primarily for its most controversial scene tend to credit. The show gives Quagmire's pain genuine screen time. It does not dismiss his difficulty, His struggle to reconcile his image of his father with the person standing in front of him is treated as a real emotional experience, not simply as a comedic springboard. There is an argument made by some defenders of the episode that this emotional sincerity around Quagmire is itself a form of respectful treatment because it locates the comedy not in Ida's identity, but in a cisgender man's struggle to accept that identity. The comedy, in this reading, is not at Ida's expense. It is at the expense of Quagmire's rigidity, his difficulty accepting something that is not about him and does not require anything of him except an updated understanding of someone he loves. This argument is coherent as far as it goes, and it goes some distance. There is real writing in the Quagmire scenes. The voice performance by Seth MacFarlane, who voices Quagmire with a specific cocktail of bluster and underlying vulnerability that the revival-era show had developed, is genuinely good in this episode. The grief is real, but then there is the other plot. Running parallel to the Quagmire storyline is a story in which Brian, the dog, meets Ida Quagmire and is attracted to her. Brian, who does not know that Ida is Quagmire's father, pursues her with some of the enthusiasm he brings to his romantic pursuits generally, which is to say with a combination of superficial charm and underlying desperation that the show had by this point established as Brian's mode. The two spend time together. Brian is charmed by her. He sleeps with her. The subsequent revelation that the woman Brian has slept with is Quagmire's father, who has recently undergone gender-confirming surgery, is treated as a horror. Brian's reaction is not discomfort or surprise or the kind of measured processing that the Quagmire storyline had modeled as an appropriate response to unexpected information. Brian's reaction is physical revulsion, and the show dwells on this revulsion at significant length. The scene in question runs for approximately 30 seconds of continuous on-screen vomiting. Brian vomits. The show stays with the vomiting. Brian continues to vomit. The scene does not cut away. It does not move to something else. It commits to the vomiting as the full expression of Brian's response to having been sexually intimate with a transgender woman. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, which monitors media representation of LGBTQ characters and issues, responded to the episode in terms that made clear their assessment of what the vomiting scene communicated. The organization's criticism was not that the episode existed or that it engaged with the subject of a parent's gender transition. The criticism was specifically about the vomiting scene and what it modeled as an appropriate emotional response to having had a sexual encounter with a transgender person. In the broader cultural context of 2010, when the episode aired, the representation of transgender people in American media was at a particular moment. The issues involved in that representation, the vocabulary around it, the frameworks for evaluating when representation is humanizing and when it is harmful, were all in the process of developing rapidly. What was considered acceptable treatment in mainstream comedy in 2010 was already being discussed and challenged in 2010, and the discussion had advanced considerably in the years since. The episode, viewed from the present, sits in a specific historical position. It was made by people who were, by the standards of their industry and their moment, attempting to engage with the subject rather than avoid it. The sincere treatment of Quagmire's emotional response is evidence of that attempt. But the vomiting scene is what remains, what gets referenced, what sits in the episode as an indelible 30 seconds that says something specific about how the show understood its audience's expected reaction to the same information that caused Brian's revulsion. Seth MacFarlane defended the episode in interviews. He described it as a sincere attempt to treat the subject with complexity, to explore Quagmire's emotional journey, to show a character grappling with something difficult and arriving, eventually, at a place of greater acceptance. These defenses are not dishonest. The Quagmire arc does arrive at something like acceptance. There is a scene later in the episode in which Quagmire and Ida have a genuine conversation that acknowledges both his pain and her reality. But the vomiting scene is not Quagmire's vomiting. It is Brian's. It is the show's most sophisticated character, the one who is supposed to be the intelligent and reflective voice, responding to the revelation with sustained, graphic revulsion. And the show holds on that revulsion for 30 seconds without cutting away, without commentary, without any subsequent character moment that recontextualizes it or suggests that the vomiting was itself a comedic exaggeration of a reaction the show does not endorse. The episode's television rating at the time was strong. It drew over 7 million viewers. Discussions of it online were immediate and extensive. It has remained a reference point in conversations about Family Guy's treatment of LGBTQ characters and issues in the years since. Ida Quagmire returned in subsequent episodes. She was voiced by Seth MacFarlane, who voiced her in a style that some found humanizing and others found itself a form of comedic treatment. Her subsequent appearances are less controversial than the original episode, partly because the original episode had already absorbed most of the debate. She is a character who exists in the show's world and is treated, across her subsequent appearances, with a kind of middling normalcy that is neither particularly respectful nor particularly cruel. The episode is the most prominent example in the show's history of an attempt to engage with LGBTQ representation that produced genuinely mixed results. The attempt is real, the failure is real. Both things are true about it, and neither cancels the other out. Part 7. Screams of Silence. The episode nobody wanted to make. There is an episode of Family Guy called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. It is the third episode of the 10th season. It aired on the 30th of October 2011, the week after Seahorse Seashell Party, which means that 2 consecutive weeks of Family Guy in the autumn of 2011 produced what are probably the 2 most uncomfortable episodes the show has ever made, back to back, in the same broadcast month. The episode involves domestic violence. It is presented as a serious exploration of the subject. It is written in a style that departs significantly from the show's usual comedic register. It has the formal qualities of a very special episode, the kind of episode that American sitcoms have made since the 1970s to engage with serious social issues, episodes that announce themselves as different from the ordinary run of the show, as engaged with something that matters in the real world. Quagmire has a sister named Brenda. Brenda has a boyfriend named Jeff. Jeff beats Brenda. The episode does not present this ambiguously. It depicts the abuse directly. Jeff is verbally abusive in the ways that verbally abusive partners are verbally abusive, cutting and systematic and specifically targeted at the places where Brenda is most vulnerable. He is physically violent. The episode shows bruises. It shows Brenda flinching. It shows the particular alert watchfulness that people who live with domestic violence develop. The constant monitoring of a partner's mood, the calculations about what can be said and when, the management of an environment that can become dangerous without warning. Brenda throughout the episode defends Jeff. This is also depicted with apparent seriousness. Brenda loves Jeff. She rationalizes his behavior. She minimizes the abuse. She turns criticism of him back on herself, locating the cause of the violence in her own deficiencies rather than in his choices. These are behaviors that people who work in domestic violence advocacy recognize as consistent with the documented patterns of people in abusive relationships. The episode appears to have done some research, or at least to have had access to some of this research, because the behaviors it depicts are behaviorally accurate in ways that not all fictional depictions of domestic violence manage to be. The reaction from Quagmire, who is Brenda's brother, is depicted as concerned and protective and ultimately, across the episode's runtime, leading toward action. He wants to get Brenda out of the relationship. He enlists Peter and Joe to help him figure out what to do. The 3 of them discuss the situation with something approaching genuine gravity. There is a scene in which Quagmire expresses his helplessness at watching someone he loves being harmed. His frustration at the way the patterns of abusive relationships make the obvious solution, simply leaving, functionally impossible for the person being harmed. This scene is not played for laughs. The episode up to its final act is strange in a specific way. It is strange because Family Guy is not structured to bear this kind of weight. The show's comedic machinery, its cutaway gags and its physical comedy and its rapid tonal shifts, is built for a different kind of engagement with its subject matter. When the show tries to be serious without those tools, when it tries to operate with the gravity of a social issue drama, the result is tonally awkward in ways that are not necessarily the show's fault. The problem is asking Family Guy to do something that Family Guy is not built to do. But the episode mostly navigates this awkwardness through the first 2 acts. There is something earnest in the attempt. You can see that the writers wanted to say something real about domestic violence. They wanted to use the show's platform to engage with something that affects millions of people and that popular culture often handles with less care than the subject deserves. And then the episode ends. The resolution of Screams of Silence involves Quagmire, with the assistance of Peter and Joe, killing Jeff. Not in a confrontational scene with consequences. Not in a context that involves law enforcement or legal accountability. Quagmire lures Jeff to the woods and murders him, and the show treats this as a satisfactory resolution to Brenda's situation. Jeff is removed. Brenda is safe. The problem is solved. The episode ends with Brenda unaware that her boyfriend has been killed by her brother, living in apparent relief at Jeff's absence, which the characters around her describe as simply his having left. She is, by the final scene, okay. She has been freed from the abuse. She does not know how. The critical response to this ending was significantly negative. The AV Club's review, which gave the episode a grade of D+, described the resolution as the episode crippling its own purposes. A serious exploration of domestic violence that ends with a vigilante murder is not, ultimately, offering the audience anything useful about domestic violence. It is offering the audience the satisfying release of a revenge fantasy, which is not the same thing, and which actively undermines the insight the earlier parts of the episode appeared to be building toward. Domestic violence is not a problem that can be resolved by killing the abuser. This is not a controversial statement in the context of domestic violence advocacy, which is built around the understanding that the patterns of abusive relationships are complex, that victims need resources and community and time and choices, that the path out of an abusive relationship is not simply the removal of the abusive person, and that the experience of surviving abuse requires ongoing support rather than a sudden dramatic rescue. An episode that earnestly depicts all of those complexities in its first 2 acts and then discards them in favor of murder as solution is an episode that does not know what it is trying to say. Or it is an episode that knows exactly what it is trying to say, which is that the audience wants the satisfaction of Jeff being dead, and that the satisfying resolution is worth more than the coherent one. There is a cynical reading of Screams of Silence that says the episode was never actually about domestic violence. It was about Quagmire, whose feelings about his sister's situation provided the emotional engine. The episode's real subject was a man's distress at watching someone he loves be harmed. The resolution, the killing of Jeff, serves that emotional engine rather than the ostensible subject. Quagmire feels better. The audience feels better. Brenda is okay. The domestic violence narrative was a vehicle for getting to a story about a brother's protective love, which is a different story, and in some ways a simpler and less demanding one. The episode was broadcast once and then largely avoided by the show in its retrospectives and clip packages. It is not one of the episodes that Family Guy promotes when it celebrates its history. It sits in the catalog, available for anyone who wants to find it, referenced in critical discussions of the show's more problematic moments, but not actively embraced by the show as representative of what it is. What Screams of Silence represents, in the broader context of Family Guy's complicated history with difficult material, is the specific failure mode of a show that has comedic ambitions, trying to do something serious without the structural vocabulary to sustain that seriousness to its conclusion. The ambition was real. The execution failed at the most important moment, which was the ending. And the ending was the message. Part 8, Turban Cowboy and the Shadow of Real Events. On the 17th of March 2013, Fox broadcast the 16th episode of Family Guy's 11th season. The episode is called Turban Cowboy. The plot involves Peter Griffin getting involved with a man he meets at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and gradually becoming friendly with what turns out to be a group of domestic terrorists. The episode has the basic comedic structure of a Peter befriends someone problematic plot, which is a recurring format in the show's history. Peter has befriended drug dealers. He has befriended organized crime figures. He has befriended various representatives of categories of people his wife would prefer he not spend time with. The comedic engine is always the same. Peter's obliviousness to the nature of his new companions, his cheerful participation in whatever they are doing without understanding what it means, and the eventual revelation that his friendship has put him in a situation that requires resolution. The episode aired on March 17th. On the 15th of April, 2013, 29 days after the episode first broadcast, 2 pressure cooker bombs detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. 264 people were injured. The bombings were the most significant act of domestic terrorism in the United States since the September 11th attacks of 2001 inches. terms of their cultural and psychological impact, and they occurred in a major American city during a public event, in clear view of cameras and crowds, in a way that made them immediate and intimate in a way that bombings in less documented contexts sometimes are not. The Turban Cowboy episode contained two specific elements that became extraordinarily uncomfortable in the context of the Boston Marathon bombings. The first was a cutaway gag in which Peter wins a car race by driving through a crowd of runners and mowing them down. The image of a vehicle running through a crowd of people during what appears to be a public athletic event, broadcast 29 days before a real attack on a real marathon, was not something that anyone involved in the episode's production could have anticipated. It was not prescient in any meaningful sense. It was a cutaway gag that happened to share visual elements with an event that had not yet occurred. But the coincidence was jarring in a specific and visceral way that made the gag unwatchable in the episode's post-bombing context. The second element was more directly related to the episode's main plot. The episode depicts a bomb being detonated as part of the narrative involving the terrorist group Peter has fallen in with. The bomb scene exists within the comedic frame of Peter's misadventures, but a comedy bomb scene broadcast weeks before a real bomb attack was, regardless of its comedic intentions, deeply uncomfortable material. Fox moved quickly. The episode was pulled from Fox.com and from Hulu, where it had been available for streaming. Amazon removed it from its streaming catalog. The episode essentially disappeared from legal digital distribution in the weeks following the bombing. Fox issued a statement expressing condolences for the victims of the attack and addressing the episode's removal. The removal of the episode prompted a secondary controversy that in some ways overshadowed the episode itself. A video began circulating online that claimed to be a clip of Turban Cowboy, and the clip, which was assembled from two separate scenes in the episode, appeared to show Peter predicting the Boston Marathon bombing, and then watching it happen. The video was a fabrication. It was edited to create a false sequence by combining footage from different parts of the episode in a way that did not represent anything that actually appeared in the broadcast. The assembled clip was not real. The fabricated clip spread rapidly on social media. It was shared by people who believed it was real. Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist, promoted the video on his platform as evidence that the Family Guy episode had somehow encoded foreknowledge of the bombing. The clip was debunked fairly quickly by media organizations that had access to the actual broadcast episode, but the debunking traveled more slowly than the original fabrication, as is generally the pattern with false information online. Some people who encountered the fabricated clip years later, in context divorced from the original debunking, encountered it as if it were real. The episode remained unavailable on major streaming platforms for years. It did not return to Hulu until September of 2022, more than 9 years after it was pulled. The return was not accompanied by announcement or fanfare. It simply reappeared in the catalog. The episode had been away long enough that a significant portion of the show's current audience would have been unaware of its existence. Turban Cowboy is the clearest example in Family Guy's history of a purely coincidental collision between the show's content and real-world events. The episode was not made with any knowledge of what would happen in Boston. The people who made it could not have known. The specific comedy of the bomb plot in the episode had been deployed in similar forms in other Family Guy episodes across the show's history without incident. The running over marathon runners gag is the kind of physical shock comedy the show uses regularly. None of this changes the fact that the episode was unwatchable in the immediate aftermath of the bombing. Comedy requires a certain kind of distance. When the distance collapses, when the fictional death and the real death are too close together in time and form, the comedy dies. Not because the show did anything wrong, but because context is not something a comedy can entirely control. The episode's history also raises the question, which recurs with other Family Guy controversies, of what a pull accomplishes. The episode aired. Millions of people saw it. It existed in recorded form in the possession of anyone who had watched it or recorded it when it broadcast. The pull from streaming prevented new viewers from encountering it in its original context, which may or may not have been valuable, depending on what you believe about the relationship between context and harm. But the episode existed and continues to exist. The fabricated clip is the most lasting consequence of the Turban Cowboy controversy. It was the first significant example, in the context of Family Guy specifically, of a conspiracy theory organizing itself around edited footage from the show. The combination of Family Guy's enormous catalog and its culture of short clips and cutaway gags circulating online made it, in retrospect, a predictable target for this kind of manipulation. A show that consists partly of short, decontextualized scenes is more vulnerable to the production of misleading compilations than a show whose content is more narratively continuous. The episode's subsequent history, its 9 years of unavailability followed by its quiet return, is a small case study in how streaming platforms manage the complicated legacy of long-running shows whose back catalogs include content that has become problematic in ways no one anticipated when it was produced. The approach of simply removing and eventually quietly restoring suggests that there is no established consensus about what to do with this kind of material, only a pragmatic management of the most acute phase of public attention. Part 9. Partial Terms of Endearment. The episode America was never allowed to see. In the history of Family Guy controversies, most of the episodes we discuss were broadcast on American television and then became controversial. The episode called Partial Terms of Endearment is different. It was made, it was completed, it was fully produced with sound and music and voice performances, it was ready to air, and then Fox decided not to broadcast it in the United States. This is the only episode of Family Guy's entire run that was never aired on Fox. It is the only episode that was actively suppressed by the network before broadcast. It sat in a vault. It aired in the United Kingdom on BBC Three in June of 2010 and in other markets. But American audiences who wanted to watch it had to find the DVD release or seek it through other means. For a period of several years, it existed in the strange liminal state of a piece of American network television that had been produced with American network money and American network infrastructure, and that Americans could not watch on American network television. The reason for its suppression was the subject matter. Partial Terms of Endearment is an episode about surrogacy and abortion. Lois agrees to be a surrogate mother for a couple whose names are Naomi and Dale, friends she reconnects with through college. Naomi has a medical condition that prevents her from carrying a pregnancy to term, and the couple has been unable to have a child through other means. Lois, moved by their situation, offers to be a surrogate. She is implanted with an embryo fertilized with Dale's sperm and Naomi's egg. The arrangement proceeds, and then Naomi dies in a skydiving accident. This is the event that drives the episode's actual conflict, the conflict that made Fox nervous enough to refuse broadcast. Naomi is dead. Dale, the surviving member of the couple, does not want the baby. He signed up for this pregnancy with his wife, to have a child with his wife, and his wife is gone. He does not want to raise a child alone. He asks Lois to terminate the pregnancy. Lois has to decide what to do. The episode explores this decision with a degree of seriousness and genuine engagement with the ethical complexity involved that is, frankly, surprising in the context of a Sunday night animated comedy about a Rhode Island working-class family. The show does not present the choice as simple. It does not present one option as obviously right and the other as obviously wrong. It presents Lois, a real character with an interior life and a moral framework, trying to navigate a genuinely difficult situation in which competing values, her commitment to Naomi and Dale's wishes, her own sense of what is right, her relationship with Peter, and the reality of the pregnancy itself are in genuine tension. Seth MacFarlane has said in interviews that the episode was based on, or at least influenced by, an essay by Carl Sagan, the astronomer and science communicator, about the ethics of abortion. Sagan's essay, which he co-authored with his wife Ann Druyan, makes an argument about the relationship between fetal development and personhood that attempts to find a rational basis for thinking about abortion that is not derived from religious doctrine. The essay is thoughtful and carefully reasoned. The influence of that kind of reasoning is visible in Partial Terms of Endearment, in the way the show approaches Lois's decision-making process. The episode does not tell you what to think. It moves through the arguments on multiple sides. Peter, who is himself opposed to abortion for reasons that are partly religious, partly conventional, and partly just the reflexive conservatism that characterizes some of his views, has a position. The arguments he makes are the real arguments that people who oppose abortion make, presented with enough seriousness to be recognizable rather than strawmanned. The arguments on the other side are also present, and also presented with enough seriousness to be recognizable. And then the episode ends. There is a choice. The episode commits to a resolution. And the choice and the resolution are what Fox decided. After reviewing the completed episode, it was not willing to put on American network television. The episode's ending is not, in itself, outrageous by any objective measure. It does not do anything that could not be described in a newspaper. But it takes a position in a debate that Fox Broadcasting, which operates with a broad national audience that includes viewers across the entire American political spectrum, was not willing to be seen as having taken. Abortion is the most consistently and acutely contested political and cultural issue in American public life. There is no other subject about which feelings run as high and as permanently as they do about abortion in the United States. A television network that airs content that can be interpreted as taking a side in the abortion debate is a television network that has decided to alienate some portion of its audience, its advertisers, and its regulatory environment. Fox made the calculation that the episode was not worth the consequences, and they did not air it. Kevin Riley, who was the president of Fox Entertainment at the time, addressed the decision publicly. He said that he thought the episode was handled well and that MacFarlane had addressed the subject with more care than he had expected. But he also said that the subject matter was simply too hot for broadcast television to touch, in the format of a primetime animated comedy. The handling was good, the subject was undoable. MacFarlane disagreed with the decision, publicly and at the time. He described the decision not to air the episode as the most overtly political thing Fox had done in relation to his show. He was frustrated. He felt the episode deserved to be seen. He believed that the care with which it had been made entitled it to a broadcast audience. His frustration is documented in several interviews from the period. The episode aired in the United Kingdom. BBC Three, which was one of the international buyers of Family Guy content, made the decision to broadcast it, and it aired there in the summer of 2010 without the kind of controversy that its non-broadcast in the United States had generated. British audiences watched it. It was reviewed. The reviews were generally positive, noting that it was more substantive than a typical Family Guy episode and that it engaged with its subject with unusual seriousness. The episode was included in DVD releases of the 8th season, which meant that American viewers who purchased the physical media could watch it at home. Its existence was not a secret. Its content was discussed online. People who were curious about it could find it. But it never aired on Fox. It has never aired on American network television. It is not currently available on Hulu, which holds the streaming rights to Family Guy's back catalog. The streaming rights situation around the episode is complicated, apparently, by the fact that the episode occupies a different legal position than episodes that were broadcast in the United States, and by ongoing considerations about what the appropriate treatment of the episode is in the current cultural moment. The episode that was deemed too controversial to air in 2010 remains, in 2024, unavailable on the primary streaming platform where American audiences watch Family Guy's back catalog. What partial terms of endearment represents in the show's history is a specific kind of censorship that is not about content being harmful or offensive in the ways that most censorship involves. The episode is not gratuitously violent. It does not contain material that the Federal Communications Commission would fine a network for broadcasting. It contains a treatment of abortion that is thoughtful, careful, and genuinely complex. Fox's decision not to air it was not about protecting audiences from harm. It was about protecting Fox from controversy. These are very different things, and the distinction matters when we think about what the episode's suppression means. Family Guy spent years making content that was offensive in the sense of generating complaints, content that the Parents Television Council objected to, content that advocacy organizations issued statements about, content that the FCC received letters demanding action against. Fox aired all of that. What Fox would not air was an episode that engaged seriously and thoughtfully with one of the most significant moral and political questions in American life. The message that this sends about what American network television considers acceptable is worth sitting with. Gross-out humor, sustained mockery of a teenage girl, a scene of sustained vomiting as a response to transgender identity. These are things Fox aired. An episode that took abortion seriously enough to dramatize its complexity without telling the audience what to think. This is what Fox kept off the American airwaves. MacFarlane's frustration, expressed at the time, has not diminished in subsequent years. He has continued to reference the episode in contexts where the show's relationship with political content is being discussed. It is the clearest example in his show's history of a case where the network's commercial caution collided directly with his own sense of what the show should be allowed to say. The episode exists. It can be found. If you have access to the 8th season DVD set, it is there. If you want to watch the episode that American network television decided you should not see, it is available to you. The gatekeeping that Fox performed in 2010 is, in the contemporary media environment, significantly less absolute than it was. Which is perhaps the most interesting thing about Partial Terms of Endearment's legacy. The controversy that made it undoable in 2010 is, from the distance of more than a decade, an artifact of a particular moment in American television's relationship with its own nervous system. Part 10. Brian Griffin and the character who became the problem. There is a specific category of disappointment that comes from watching a character you admired become someone you do not recognize, and it is different from the disappointment of watching a show get worse in general terms. The general decline of a show is diffuse, distributed across episodes and seasons, something you feel accumulating rather than something you can point to. The decline of a specific character you cared about is more personal and more located. You can identify the episodes. You can describe the change. You can feel the specific loss of something that was there and is now gone. Brian Griffin was the character that a certain kind of Family Guy viewer cared about most in the early seasons. Not Stewie, whose comedy was brilliantly executed but whose identity was essentially a single sustained premise. Not Peter, whose lovability was always bounded by his obliviousness. Brian was the character who seemed to understand things. He was the one who read books that were worth reading. He was the one who had opinions about art and politics that came from somewhere real. He was the one who, when the family was in chaos, could step back and name what was happening with a clarity that nobody else in the household could access. He was also, crucially, the one with genuine vulnerabilities that the show took seriously. His failure as a novelist, his difficulty with romantic relationships, his drinking, his tendency towards self-delusion in specifically human ways. These were not comedic tics in the early seasons. They were the evidence of a real interior life, a character who wanted things and could not always get them, and had complicated feelings about the distance between his aspirations and his circumstances. The early Brian was a person you might know. He was a person you might, in certain configurations of your own life, be. The transformation of Brian across the revival seasons is one of the clearest examples of what critics and viewers call Flanderization, the process by which a complex character is gradually reduced to a single defining trait, usually the most extreme or most comedically useful version of one element of their original character. In Brian's case, the trait that expanded to fill the space of his entire personality was his intellectual pretension. In the early seasons, Brian's sense of his own intelligence was one element of a complex character. It was balanced by his genuine intelligence in many areas, his real care for Peter and the family, his self-awareness about his own flaws. In the revival seasons, the pretension expanded and the substance behind it contracted until what was left was a character who claimed sophistication without the evidence to back it up, who claimed moral superiority while behaving in ways that were worse than the people he criticized. The episode that many viewers point to as the moment Brian became genuinely difficult to like is Brian Writes a Bestseller from the 9th season. In this episode, Stewie, who has been one of Brian's most consistent supporters and who has maintained their friendship through many of Brian's worst moments, encourages Brian to return to writing after a long fallow period. Brian takes Stewie's encouragement and writes a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It, which becomes a surprise commercial success and makes Brian briefly famous. And then Brian is horrible to Stewie. Not complicated about it, not ambivalently complicated, genuinely horrible. He dismisses the person who believed in him when he had stopped believing in himself. He treats Stewie's pride in Brian's success as an imposition. He is arrogant in ways that are specific and deliberate and aimed at the person least deserving of that arrogance. The episode makes the dynamic explicit. Stewie helped Brian. Brian succeeded. Brian turned his success into a weapon against Stewie. There is no mitigation of this in the episode. There is no moment in which Brian understands what he is doing. The success does not last, and the ending finds Brian back in more ordinary circumstances, but the character revelation stands. This is who Brian is now when given an occasion to reveal himself. The Quagmire speech from Season 8's Jerome is the New Black is the other frequently cited marker of how far Brian had drifted from his original character. Quagmire and Brian have always had a tense relationship within the show's world, and in this episode, Quagmire explains his hatred of Brian directly. The speech covers Brian's phoniness as an intellectual, his treatment of Lois, his failure as a father, his hypocrisy, his self-delusion. Each element of the speech is supported by actual events in the show. It is not an exaggeration. It is a summary. What is interesting about the Quagmire speech is that the show clearly intends for the audience to side with Quagmire. The speech is constructed to be accurate. The writers were aware, by this point in the show's run, that Brian had become insufferable to a portion of the audience, and they chose to address this by having another character articulate the problem. In one sense, this is the show being self-aware. In another sense, it is the show being self-aware in exactly the way that does not require it to change anything. Quagmire says the true things about Brian. Brian is briefly shaken, and then nothing changes. Brian does not become less of what Quagmire described. He becomes, across subsequent seasons, more of it. The death of Brian in the 12th season, in an episode called Life of Brian, created a national conversation that the show almost certainly did not anticipate reaching the scale it did. Brian is hit by a car. He dies. The show treats his death seriously. Stewie grieves. The family grieves. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of The Sopranos, comes to live with the Griffins. The episode aired in November of 2013 and generated immediate and extensive public response. The response was partly grief from viewers who had genuinely loved Brian despite or alongside his later characterization, and partly fury from viewers who read the death as a manipulation, a rating stunt designed to generate exactly the attention it generated. The decision to then reverse Brian's death 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode, by having Stewie use a stolen time travel device to go back and save Brian before the accident, confirmed for many people that the death had been a calculated move rather than a creative decision about the character and the show. The permanent death of a main character in an animated show is genuinely rare. When it happens and then is undone within 2 episodes, the message it sends about the show's relationship with its own stakes is significant. If nothing is permanent, if any consequence can be undone by the next convenient plot device, then the stakes of the show are always effectively zero. The audience is invited to care and then told that their caring was never required, because the thing they cared about was always going to be taken back. Brian continued after his return. The character did not undergo any reformation based on the experience of his death and resurrection. He resumed his characteristic behaviors. In subsequent seasons, including some in the mid-teens range of the show's run, Brian did things that were difficult to account for even within the logic of the character's decline. He found a woman trapped in a car that was about to go over a cliff, began to help her, and then, upon learning that she had a child and was therefore probably married, let go and allowed the car to fall. The episode depicts Brian choosing to let a woman and her child die because her unavailability for dating made her life seem, to him, less worth preserving than the effort required to save it. This is not a comedy beat. It is not a setup for a punchline. It is a depiction of a character making a choice to allow an innocent person and her child to die for reasons that have no moral justification, and the show presents it without sustained consequence or examination. The early Brian would have been appalled by the later Brian. This is not a speculative statement. You can watch the early episodes and see what the character's values were, see how he responded to human suffering, see what his friendship with the Griffin family meant to him, and how that meaning shaped his choices. The early Brian and the later Brian share a design and a voice and a name. They do not share much else. The complexity in assessing Brian's trajectory is that the show, across the revival seasons, does occasionally produce Brian at his best. There are episodes where the warmth and intelligence and genuine care of the original character surface clearly and convincingly. The bottle episode Brian and Stewie, from Season 8, is perhaps the finest episode the show has ever produced. A 22-minute real-time conversation between 2 characters locked in a vault that achieves something genuine about loneliness and friendship and the difficulty of being alive. Brian in that episode is the character who should have existed across the revival seasons. He is perceptive and honest and frightened in ways that are human and real. He talks about why he keeps a gun in his safety deposit box. The show does not flinch. And then the following week, or the week after, or in some later episode that the same writers made in the same writer's room for the same show, Brian is someone else again. The coexistence of these two versions of the character, across the same run, is one of the show's most honest testimonies to its own inconsistency. Part 11. The Outer Limits, everything else that made people look twice. The episodes we have examined so far are the landmarks, the ones that generated press releases and lawsuits and network decisions and national conversations. They are the episodes that people cite when they are explaining Family Guy's relationship with difficult material. But the show's complicated history is not made up only of landmarks. There is also the ongoing texture of the show's ordinary episodes, the regular weekly run of Family Guy across more than 20 seasons, in which choices were made that did not generate single-episode controversies, but that accumulated into something real and worth examining. Herbert the Pervert is the clearest example of this accumulation. Herbert is an elderly man who has been a recurring character since the show's second season, which aired in the year 2000. He is voiced by Seth MacFarlane, in a voice that has specific and recognizable qualities: slow, slightly tremulous, suggesting the frailty of age combined with something else entirely. Herbert is depicted as sexually attracted to underage boys. This is not ambiguous. The show does not use euphemism. Herbert's interest in Chris Griffin, the Griffin family's teenage son, is explicit, running, and presented as comedy. He has appeared in dozens of episodes. His appearances consistently involve his attraction to adolescent boys as the comedic premise. There have been episodes in which Herbert's history is elaborated, including revelations about his past that the show uses to build complexity around him without ever genuinely addressing the nature of his comedic function in the series. There is an episode, often cited by people attempting to defend the character's presence, in which Herbert kills a former Nazi, framing the act as a form of justice. The suggestion is that this revelation balances, or at least complicates, his other characteristics. It does not. The ongoing presence of Herbert across the show's run is a specific kind of problem. It is not a single episode that can be discussed in isolation. It is a choice that the show has renewed in nearly every season for more than 2 decades, to continue making jokes about an adult man's sexual attraction to children. The longevity of the joke does not indicate that it has been handled carefully. It indicates that the show made a decision early and kept making it without revisiting whether it was still the right decision or whether it had ever been the right decision. Hot Shots is an episode from the 15th season, which aired in the 2016 to 2017 broadcast year, that addresses the anti-vaccination movement. In the episode, Peter and Lois become anti-vaccination advocates after a misread experience, and their advocacy spreads through Quahog with the particular virality that bad information has in close communities. The episode involves a cutaway that depicts Peter as the Joker, in a visual reference to the Batman villain walking away from an exploding hospital after destroying the town's vaccine supply. The episode aired during a period when the anti-vaccination movement was generating significant public health concern in the United States, a period when measles outbreaks were occurring in communities with low vaccination rates, and public health officials were actively trying to counter the spread of misinformation about vaccine safety. The episode was, by the standards of the show's approach to current events, reasonably current in its subject matter. The question it raises, the question that several critics raised at the time of its broadcast, was whether a comedic treatment of vaccine hesitancy that frames the consequences as an explosion and a Joker reference is adequately engaged with the subject's real stakes. The comedy of the episode, such as it is, requires treating the deaths of children who are not vaccinated as a comedic premise. The joke works, insofar as it works, because the consequences of the anti-vaccination movement are depicted in a visually spectacular way rather than in the specific and personal way that those consequences actually manifest. A child who contracts measles because they were not vaccinated does not look like an exploding hospital. They look like a sick child. The explosion is funny. The sick child is not. A Shot in the Dark, from the 14th season, engaged with the death of Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old Black American who was shot and killed in February of 2012 by a neighborhood watch volunteer named George Zimmerman in Sanford, Florida. The case became one of the most discussed events in American racial discourse in the 2010s, raising questions about racial profiling, the legal treatment of Black Americans, and the specific vulnerability of young black men in interactions with authority and pseudo-authority figures. In A Shot in the Dark, Cleveland's son, Cleveland Jr., is accidentally shot by Peter, who mistakes him for a burglar in the dark. The episode uses this setup as a vehicle for commenting on racial dynamics in American culture, on the presumption of criminality that has been documented as a feature of how black men and boys are perceived in predominantly white communities, on the legal and social frameworks that govern the use of force against black people. The episode tries to be engaged with this material. It is not indifferent to the weight of what it is using, but the use itself, the deployment of the death of a real young man as a comedic premise in an animated sitcom, is the thing that several critics found inadequate to the material. Not because the show was not allowed to engage with racial violence, because the tools it brought to that engagement, cutaway gags, Peter's comedic obliviousness, the resolution of genuine social critique through the show's usual comedic machinery, were not sufficient for what the subject required. The episode Boys and Squirrels, from the 13th season, involves Brian killing a baby squirrel that Chris and Stewie have been nursing back to health. The squirrel has become important to Chris and Stewie. It has a name, it has been given care and attention across the episode, and then Brian kills it, graphically, and faces essentially no consequences. The episode is sometimes referenced in discussions of Brian's character decline as an example of the show's willingness to have Brian do genuinely harmful things for no clearly articulated reason and with no genuine reckoning. The Conway Twitty gags, which appeared across multiple seasons starting from around the 5th, are a different kind of problem from these episodes. But they belong in the same conversation because they represent the same underlying issue from a different angle. Conway Twitty was a country music singer who was enormously successful in the 1970s and 1980s. He died in 1993. The Family Guy gag involves cutting away from the main episode to show a performance by Conway Twitty. Not a brief clip, not a reference, but an extended, unedited musical performance that could run for a minute or more. No punchline, no connection to the episode. The joke is that the show has replaced comedy with a country music video. The first time this gag appeared, it was unexpected enough to be genuinely funny in the way that committed absurdism can be funny. The subsequent times it appeared, it was generally experienced as an extended period during which the show did not have enough material to fill the episode and chose to deploy filler rather than acknowledge the gap. Critics pointed to the Conway Twitty gags as among the most visible evidence of the show's declining creative ambition in the middle seasons. The gag is not harmful in the way that other items on this list are harmful. It is simply a very candid admission, broadcast in primetime on a major network, that the writers had nothing to put in this space and were willing to leave it empty rather than fill it. The fourth wall breaking episodes, which became increasingly common across the later seasons, occupy a particular space in the show's relationship with its own problems. There are episodes in which characters directly acknowledge that Family Guy has been on too long, that the show's quality has declined, that the characters themselves are aware of being characters on a declining show. The show makes jokes about its own continued existence. It makes jokes about the network's decisions. It makes jokes about the writer's room. This self-awareness is not nothing. It is evidence that the people making the show understand the criticism that has been leveled at it. They know the show has changed. They know the audience has noticed. The jokes about the show's decline are their acknowledgement of that awareness. But acknowledgement without change is a specific kind of deflection. When a show makes a joke about its own problems rather than addressing those problems, it is using comedy as a shield against critique. The joke is, yes, we know this is bad, isn't that funny? And the audience is invited to laugh at the show's self-awareness rather than to question why the problems remain. The self-deprecating joke protects the status quo. It says we are in on it while declining to do anything about it. The show has been running for 25 years. That longevity itself has produced a body of material that is, by sheer volume, extraordinary in its range of engagement with difficult topics. Some of that engagement has been thoughtful and has produced television that stands up as genuinely good. The Bottle episode. The surrogacy episode that America was not allowed to see. Moments scattered across seasons where the show's genuine intelligence and genuine care for its characters surfaced clearly. And some of it has been careless, or worse, an ongoing willingness to use the most vulnerable characters in the show's world as objects of sustained cruelty in the name of comedy, a willingness to engage with serious cultural topics with insufficient tools and insufficient follow-through, a willingness to let the shock of a scene substitute for the craft of a scene. Both things are true about Family Guy, and have been true about it across its entire run. The show that produced Partial Terms of Endearment and Brian and Stewie is the same show that produced Screams of Silence and 23 Years of Herbert the Pervert. The same writer's room, the same creator, the same network, the same Sunday night slot. The coexistence of these things is not incidental to what Family Guy is. It is what Family Guy is. Part 12. What the show was, what it became, and why any of it matters. We are near the end now. The episodes have been described, the controversies have been placed in their context, the characters have been followed through their changes. What remains is something more like reflection than narration, the kind of sitting with it that a long description of complicated material requires before you can put it down and let it rest. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, and as of this recording, it is still being made. That is more than 25 years of a single animated comedy. 25 years of a creative work that was built by one person's vision and has been maintained with varying degrees of fidelity to that vision across a vast span of American cultural history. The show has outlasted the cultural moments it originally satirized. It has outlasted some of the people who made it. It has outlasted the network relationships and the cultural agreements and the comedic conventions that framed its early years. What stays with you, if you spend time with the show's history from beginning to present, is a specific quality of longing. Not for the show to be different than it is now. The show is what it is now, and what it is now is a product of 25 years of specific choices made by specific people under specific pressures. The longing is for the version of the show that existed in those first 3 seasons, the version that had the warmth and the specificity and the genuine care for its characters that the early episodes demonstrated so clearly. The early show had a quality that is actually quite difficult to sustain in American network comedy. It was funny and it was kind. Not sentimental, not soft, not unwilling to engage with dark material or difficult humor. Kind in the sense that it treated the characters it had created as people whose interior lives mattered, whose relationships were worth taking seriously, whose failures and struggles were connected to recognizable human experiences. The comedy was sharp, but the show beneath the comedy was warm, and the warmth was what made the comedy land in the way it did. That warmth is what drained away across the revival seasons, and its loss is what connects all of the specific controversies and specific episodes we have discussed tonight. The Meg problem is a problem because the show stopped caring about Meg as a person and started caring about her only as a resource for a particular kind of comedy. The Screams of Silence problem is a problem because the show engaged with a serious subject without the care that subject required. The Brian problem is a problem because the character who was supposed to embody the show's intelligence was gradually hollowed out until what remained was an advertisement for intelligence without the substance that made the advertisement meaningful. These are connected failures. They are expressions of the same underlying change in the show's relationship with its own characters and its own purposes. The moments of genuine quality that continued to surface across the revival seasons, the Partial Terms of Endearment episode that America was never allowed to see, the Brian and Stewie bottle episode, the occasional flashes of the early warmth in episodes that otherwise fell into the show's later patterns, are equally connected. They are evidence that the capacity was never lost. The writers who produced the show's worst moments were the same writers who produced its best moments. The room that generated 20 years of diminished Meg generated the Seahorse Seashell Party speech, however imperfectly it handled the speech's aftermath. The capacity was always there. The question was always what the capacity was being used for. American network television is a specific environment that produces specific pressures. The pressure to generate 22 episodes per year. The pressure to maintain ratings in a landscape of increasing competition and changing viewing habits. The pressure to remain culturally relevant across decades, during which the culture changes in ways that no one can predict. The pressure from advertisers, from advocacy organizations, from network executives, from the creator's own other projects and other ambitions. These pressures do not excuse the worst choices the show made. but they help explain how a show that knew what good looked like kept making choices that were not good. Seth MacFarlane built something that mattered. In 1999, he pitched a 15-minute pilot to a network executive, and from that pitch came a show that 22 million people watched on its first night, and that tens of millions of people have watched in some form across the 25 years since. The show changed what American animated comedy could look like. It demonstrated that the cutaway gag format could sustain a primetime network comedy. It proved that an animated show could find an audience large enough to survive cancellation and return from the dead. It produced, in its best moments, television that was genuinely good by any measure. The controversies do not erase the accomplishments. The accomplishments do not excuse the controversies. Both things are real, and real things do not become less real because other real things exist alongside them. What you carry away from the show's history depends on what you were looking for when you came to it. If you came for the comedy, the early seasons gave you some of the sharpest animated comedy that American television produced in the late 1990s and early 2000s. If you came for the controversies, the show delivered them in volume and variety across its entire run. If you came for the characters, the early show gave you characters that felt like people, and the later show gave you versions of those characters that were easier to laugh at and harder to love. If you came for something like truth, you got pieces of it. Not consistently, not reliably, but pieces of it scattered across the episodes in the moments when the show let itself be honest about what it was doing and what the people in it were going through. The Meg speech, the vault conversation, the episode that American network television decided you should not be allowed to see. These are pieces of truth. They are not the whole show. They are the moments when the show reached for something real and found it, which is not nothing, which is in fact something, which is evidence that the reaching was always possible. The show is still running. More episodes are being made. The controversies are not over. They are ongoing because the show is ongoing, and a show that has engaged with as much as Family Guy has engaged with across 25 years does not simply stop generating the kinds of decisions and moments that we have been describing tonight. There will be more to talk about. For now, we have come to the end of what we set out to cover. Every banned episode, every controversy, every moment that made people stop and wonder what they were laughing at and whether they should be laughing at it, every character who changed in ways that were disappointing, and every character who changed in ways that produced something genuinely new. Every decision, good and bad, that the show made across a quarter-century of American network television. It is a lot to carry. You do not have to carry all of it tonight. Closing, if you are still awake, if you have been following all of this from the beginning to the end, thank you. You gave this a lot of your time, and I hope it was worth it. If you drifted off somewhere in the middle, somewhere around the revival seasons, or Meg's speech, or the episode America was never allowed to see, that is completely fine. Everything described here will still be here when you want to come back to it. The controversies are not going anywhere. The episodes are not going anywhere. The history is fixed, documented, available. Sleep well tonight. Let all of it rest at the edge of your awareness. The way the best late-night content does. Present but not demanding. There if you want it, and easily released if you do not. If you enjoyed spending this time here, please subscribe. It is the most direct way to support this kind of long, careful, unhurried exploration of the things we grew up watching and the things we have complicated feelings about. A subscription takes 3 seconds and tells the algorithm that this kind of work is worth keeping visible. And if you have thoughts about any of the episodes we discussed, about whether we got something right or got something wrong, about which moment you think deserved more time or less, leave them in the comments. This is a conversation, not a lecture. Your perspective on the show's history is part of the story. Wherever you are watching this from, whatever time it is where you are, I hope the rest of your night is quiet and easy. We will be here when you need us again. End of script. Extended reflection. The show's relationship with its own history. Before we close this chapter entirely and move forward, it is worth pausing to think about something that the individual episodes and controversies do not capture on their own, which is the relationship between Family Guy and the way it understood itself over time. One of the more unusual features of the show across its long run is its willingness to engage with its own past. There are episodes that return to the earliest seasons and comment on them, episodes that bring back characters from long-ago storylines, episodes that reference the show's cancellation and revival as part of their comedy. The show has a relationship with its own mythology that most animated comedies do not develop, because most animated comedies do not survive long enough to have mythology worth returning to. There is an episode called Back to the Pilot, from the 10th season, in which Brian and Stewie use time travel to visit the very first episode of the series. They observe their past selves. They interact with the show at the moment of its beginning. The episode is aware that what the audience is watching is the show looking at itself, comparing what it was to what it has become, and the comedy of the episode is partly the comedy of recognizing the gap between those two things. What is striking about Back to the Pilot is how honest it manages to be, within the constraints of its comedic format, about the scale of the change. The characters in the pilot look and behave differently from the characters in the 10th season. The animation style is different. The energy is different. The episode captures something real about the distance between the show's beginning and its current iteration. This capacity for self-reflection, present in the show intermittently across its run, is one of the things that makes Family Guy's history more interesting than the history of a show that simply declined without awareness of its own decline. The show knew, or at least parts of the show, in certain episodes, in certain moments of the writing, demonstrated knowledge of what had happened. The question of whether that knowledge obligated the show to do anything about it, and why the show so consistently chose not to, is one of the more interesting questions in American television comedy. The answer probably has something to do with the economics and the inertia of a long-running hit, with the fact that changing the fundamental nature of a show that is still generating revenue is a different proposition than it appears from outside, with the reality that a writer's room is not a single unified consciousness, but a collection of individuals with different views about what the show should be doing and different amounts of influence over what it actually does. The knowledge that something has gone wrong does not automatically produce the will or the ability to fix it, but the knowledge was there. And that knowledge, expressed in episodes like Back to the Pilot and in the countless fourth-wall jokes about the show's decline, is its own form of testimony. The show that produced the Herbert the Pervert gags for 20-plus years also, in other episodes, acknowledged that it had become something its original self might not have recognized. Both of these things are part of what Family Guy is. Extended reflection. The voice cast and what they carried. It would be incomplete to spend this much time on the show's history without acknowledging the voice performances that inhabited these characters across every episode, every controversy, every moment of the show's complicated run. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire, among others. This is an extraordinary range of characters for a single performer to carry across the length of a season, let alone across 25 seasons. The technical demands of voicing 4 distinct main characters in a show that requires recording sessions for every episode would be significant even for a performer whose only job it was. MacFarlane did it while also being the show's creator, an executive producer, a film director, and eventually a television creator in his own right for The Orville. The quality of the voice performances is remarkably consistent across the show's run. Whatever else changed about Family Guy, whatever declined in terms of writing and character consistency and creative ambition, the performances remained. Peter Griffin sounds like Peter Griffin. Brian sounds like Brian. Stewie sounds like Stewie. The vocal characterizations that MacFarlane established in the pilot, and that have been maintained with extraordinary fidelity across hundreds of episodes, are one of the more durable achievements of the show's long run. Alex Borstein voices Lois Griffin and has voiced Lois from the very first episode. Borstein is also a writer and comedian whose career has expanded significantly since Family Guy began, including her Emmy-winning performance in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. But Lois has remained a constant across that entire period. The warm, slightly exasperated voice that Borstein brings to Lois is the primary reason Lois has remained a coherent character even when the writing for her has been inconsistent. A voice performance can carry a character through writing that does not quite serve her, and Borstein has done exactly that for 25 years. Mila Kunis has voiced Meg Griffin since the second episode of the first season, taking over from Lacey Chabert, who did the role in the pilot. Kunis was 19 years old when she began doing the voice, and was simultaneously starring in That 70s Show, which had its own enormous cultural footprint in the late 1990s. The task of voicing Meg across the show's entire run, through all of the treatment Meg received across those years, required a performer with enough craft to keep the character recognizable and enough equanimity to maintain a professional relationship with material that was not always kind to the person doing the voicing. Seth Green voices Chris Griffin. Green is a performer and creator with a long career outside Family Guy that includes the stop-motion animation series Robot Chicken, which he created and produces. His work on Family Guy has always been of a piece with his other creative work, which tends to find comedy in a specific kind of sincere oddness. In the comedy that comes from people who are genuinely trying and genuinely confused, rather than from people who are too cool to care. These performers, and the others in the supporting cast, including Patrick Warburton as Joe Swanson and Mike Henry as Cleveland Brown and many others, sustained the show through every creative shift and every controversy. Their work is part of what made the show's failures noticeable, because the performances gave the characters enough reality that the writing's failures in handling them were visible. A wooden performance in a bad script is invisible. A real performance in a bad script lets you see exactly where the script fails. Extended reflection, the rating story, and what the numbers mean. We have talked about specific episodes and specific characters and specific moments of controversy, but there is a longer story running beneath all of these specific things that is worth examining. The story of what happened to the show's audience across its run. The first episode drew 22 million viewers in January of 1999. That number is the high watermark of the show's American television history, inflated significantly by the Super Bowl broadcast that preceded it, and it is not a realistic baseline for evaluating the show's subsequent performance. But even discounting the Super Bowl bump, the first season average of 12.8 million households is a significant number for a new animated comedy. The show was canceled in 2002 after 3 seasons, largely because its ratings had declined significantly from that opening benchmark. Fox had shuffled it across multiple time slots, competing first against Frasier on NBC and then against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, and neither competition served the show well. The ratings decline was at least partly a function of scheduling rather than declining audience interest, which the Adult Swim rerun numbers subsequently confirmed. When the show returned in 2005, Season 4 averaged approximately 7.9 million viewers. This was a strong return by any measure, evidence that the audience that had kept the show alive through DVDs and Adult Swim reruns was ready to show up for new episodes on Fox. The revival was a genuine success at the ratings level. From that 2005 peak, the audience declined year by year across the revival seasons. Season 7, from 2008 to 2009, averaged around 8.1 million viewers, a slight rise that may reflect the post-writers' strike recovery. But across the teens of the show's season numbers, the decline was consistent. Season 13, from 2014 to 2015, averaged approximately 5.9 million viewers. Season 17, from 2018 to 2019, was below 4 million. By the time the show reached its 20s in terms of season numbers, it was drawing numbers well below 2 million in the key demographic that advertisers use to set their rates. The show was moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, a scheduling change that the television industry generally reads as a network acknowledging that a show is no longer a primetime centerpiece. The Sunday night animation block on Fox had been Family Guy's home for most of its revival run. Losing that spot was a significant indicator of the show's standing with the network, and yet the show was renewed. Not just for one more season, but for several more seasons, in a deal that takes it through the late 2020s. This is because, as we have discussed, the economics of animated television are different from the economics of live-action television. The show costs relatively little to produce compared to what it earns across its entire content ecosystem, including streaming rights and reruns and merchandise and international distribution. The audience that watches new episodes of Family Guy on Wednesday nights in 2024 is genuinely small compared to the audience that watched new episodes on Sunday nights in 2005. But the audience that encounters Family Guy somewhere in the vast landscape of American and global media, in reruns on Adult Swim, in clips on YouTube, in complete season binge watches on Hulu, in the half-remembered episodes of people who grew up watching it and retain it as part of their cultural memory, is enormous. The show exists in the culture in ways that its current weekly ratings do not capture. This distinction matters for thinking about the controversies we have described tonight. When the Screams of Silence episode aired in October of 2011, the audience watching it live was significant. When someone watches that episode now, as part of a casual binge through the show's available seasons on a streaming platform, they are watching it in a completely different context, probably without the awareness of the specific moment in which it was made, possibly without the memory of the critical response it generated. The controversies that defined specific episodes in their original broadcast context become less legible as those episodes age into the catalog. This is true of all of the episodes we have discussed. They exist now in a context that is not the context in which they were made. The Quagmire's Dad episode, made in 2010, exists in a cultural landscape around transgender representation that is significantly different from 2010. The Turban Cowboy episode, made in 2013, exists in a relationship to the Boston Marathon bombing that changes as the bombing recedes in cultural memory. The Partial Terms of Endearment episode, made and suppressed in 2010, exists in a relationship to American reproductive rights debates that has shifted dramatically since the Dobbs decision in 2022. Context does not resolve the questions that these episodes raise. But context is part of what determines how those questions are posed, and the context keeps changing, and the episodes keep sitting in the catalog, fixed in their content, and variable in their meaning. Extended reflection on the nature of comedy and discomfort. The last thing worth saying, before we genuinely finish and let the quiet come back in, is something about what we are actually doing when we laugh at things that are also uncomfortable. Family Guy has spent 25 years operating in the space between comedy and discomfort, between jokes that work and jokes that work in ways that require examination. The show is not unique in this. American comedy in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has been extensively interested in discomfort as a comedic tool, in the kind of laughter that comes with a slight catch, the laughter that makes you want to immediately determine whether you were supposed to laugh at that or whether you have just revealed something about yourself by laughing at it. This is not an accident. Discomfort is genuinely useful in comedy because it creates energy. The laughter that comes from something unexpected, from something that violates a social expectation or crosses a line that the audience expected to remain intact, has a particular quality of release that less transgressive humor does not produce. This is why shock has always been part of the comedian's toolkit, going back long before animated television, long before television of any kind. The problem with discomfort as a comedic tool is that it has diminishing returns. The first time something unexpected happens, it is unexpected. The 10th time it happens, in the same form, with the same mechanism, it is not unexpected. It is anticipated. The shock has been absorbed into the audience's framework for understanding what the show does. And once the shock is absorbed, what remains is whatever was underneath it. In the case of Meg, what was underneath the shock of the cruelty, once the cruelty was no longer shocking because it had been repeated hundreds of times, was a teenage girl being hurt. In the case of the Herbert jokes, what was underneath the shock was the ongoing comedic use of an adult man's sexual attraction to children. In the case of the violence that escalated across the revival seasons, what was underneath the shock was, increasingly, just violence, without the comedic construct that had initially framed it. This is the mechanism by which the show, across 25 years of operating in the space between comedy and discomfort, shifted the balance. What had been comedy with discomfort attached became discomfort with comedy attached, and eventually, in some of its worst moments, simply discomfort, with the comedy having retreated to a point where it was no longer doing the work of justifying what the show was asking its audience to experience. The question of whether the show was ever doing enough with the discomfort, whether the comedy was ever sufficient justification for what accompanied it, is a question that reasonable people answered differently and have been answering differently since 1999. There is no final answer. There is only the specific evidence of the specific episodes, the specific characters, the specific choices, which we have tried to describe with as much care and as much fairness as the subject requires. The show at its best was using discomfort the way the best comedy uses it, as a way of getting somewhere true that comfort cannot reach. The show at its worst was using discomfort because the discomfort was easy and the truth was hard, and the audience was large enough that no one could be sure exactly what percentage of them were laughing for the right reasons. Both of those things are Family Guy. Both of those things are part of its 25-year history. And both of them are part of what you take with you when you turn off the screen and let the night come in and let whatever was keeping you awake begin to ease. Deep dive. The cancellation years and what they did to the show. Between May of 2002 and May of 2005, Family Guy did not exist on American network television. This period, roughly 36 months, is usually described in the show's history as the gap, the pause, the time away. These are neutral terms for something that was not, for the people who made the show, a neutral experience. When a television show is canceled, what happens practically is that the production apparatus that supported it is dismantled. The writers' contracts are not renewed. The writers, who had been in a specific room with specific people, developing a specific tone and a specific voice for the show, go elsewhere. Some go to other shows. Some develop their own projects. Some leave the industry entirely or move into other areas of writing. The shared vocabulary of a writer's room, the accumulated understanding of what these characters are and how they speak, and what is funny about them in ways that are specific to this show and not generic, disperses into other contexts where it does not apply in the same way. The animation staff similarly disperses. The production staff moves on to other work. The voice actors maintain their other careers. They are working actors who have other projects and other commitments, and the cancellation of one show is a disruption in their working lives that they absorb and move past. The show as a living thing, a thing that requires ongoing human attention and investment to exist, stops living. When Family Guy was brought back in 2005, what Fox was bringing back was not the living show but the archived show. The name, the characters, the general premise, the format, these things could be recovered from the first 3 seasons and used as the foundation for new production. But the specific human ecosystem that had produced those first 3 seasons, the particular chemistry of that writer's room, the specific understanding that MacFarlane and his original collaborators had developed about what the show was, that was gone. It had to be rebuilt. Seth MacFarlane has been candid about this in interviews across the years. He has described the challenge of restaffing the show's writer's room after each cancellation, the difficulty of finding people who understood what the show was trying to do and could execute that understanding at the level the early seasons had established. This is not a complaint about the quality of the writers who joined for the revival seasons. Many of them were genuinely talented and went on to successful careers in television. It is an observation about the specific and non-transferable knowledge that gets lost when a creative ensemble is dispersed and has to be reassembled. The Adult Swim years contributed to the challenge in a way that is sometimes overlooked. When Family Guy ran on Adult Swim, the audience that formed around it was not identical to the broadcast network audience that had watched it on Fox. Adult Swim ran in the late-night hours and drew a specific demographic: young adult men, college-aged, and immediately post-college, watching television in the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning, an audience that had different taste profiles and different thresholds for certain kinds of comedy than the Sunday night broadcast audience. The Adult Swim audience had made its preferences known through ratings, and those preferences had in part saved the show. The question for the revival writers' room was which audience they were writing for. The evidence of the revival season suggests that the answer was both, which is rarely a satisfying answer to that question. The show tried to maintain enough broad appeal to compete in the Sunday night primetime slot while also trying to serve the more specific preferences of the late-night audience that had kept it alive. The result was a show that was, at its best, actually very funny for both audiences, and that, at its worst, seemed to be chasing the late-night audience's appetite for transgression while losing the warmth and the character consistency that had made the broadcast audience love it in the first place. The 3-year gap also changed MacFarlane personally. He was 25 when he created the show and 31 when he brought it back. That 6-year span covers, for most people, a significant amount of personal development, experience, and change. The show he brought back in 2005 was inevitably colored by who he had become in the years between, by the things he had learned about the industry and about himself, and about what he wanted his show to be doing. Whether those changes improved or diminished the show depends on which episodes you look at and what you value about them. Deep dive. The Stewie problem, what was lost, and why it mattered. The transformation of Stewie Griffin across the show's run is, in some ways, the most philosophically interesting of the character changes we have described. It is interesting because the people who made it did so deliberately and have been willing to explain their reasoning, and because the reasoning, while internally coherent, points to a specific failure mode in creative decision-making that appears in many long-running shows. In the original 3 seasons, Stewie was the most conceptually original element of Family Guy. The evil genius baby premise was not in itself original. There is a long history of fictional child villains and fictional child geniuses in literature and in animation. What was original about Stewie was the specific combination of elements: the Edwardian vocal register, the elaborate technical capability, the fixation on Lois as the primary target of his schemes, and the comedy of his absolute powerlessness within the household despite all of this capability. He could build a time machine. He could not reach the top shelf of the refrigerator. The early Stewie was also genuinely menacing in a way that the comedy depended on. His plans were not merely grandiose. They were specific. He had blueprints, he had schematics, he had timetables. The world domination plans were not background color. They were something that the show took seriously enough to give Stewie genuine dramatic scenes in which his intelligence and his malevolence were real and were threatening things that only happened not to succeed because of external circumstances. The decision to move away from this premise was made, according to MacFarlane and the other writers who have discussed it, because they felt the joke had been taken as far as it could go. They had done the evil baby premise. They had found everything funny about it. Continuing to do it, they believed, would be repetitive rather than creative. This reasoning deserves examination because it is the reasoning that underlies many creative decisions that turn out to be mistakes. The premise that a joke can be exhausted, that there is a finite amount of comedy in any given character concept, is sometimes true and sometimes false, and the difficulty lies in knowing which situation you are in. The evil baby premise was not a finite premise. It was, if anything, an expansive one. An evil genius baby who wants to take over the world and kill his mother is a premise with essentially unlimited comedic potential because the world keeps changing, and the baby keeps not growing up, and new targets and new situations and new aspects of the central character are available indefinitely. The premise does not have a natural endpoint. It does not run out of material in the way that, say, a single joke premise or a premise built on a specific cultural moment might run out of material. What the writers ran out of was their own interest in the premise. They had done a certain number of things with it and could not, in the moment, imagine doing enough new things with it to justify its continuation. That is a failure of imagination, which is something that happens to creative people, and it is not necessarily a moral failing. But it is a different thing from the premise itself being exhausted. The premise was not exhausted. The writers were. The replacement premise, Stewie as emotionally vulnerable and identity uncertain and deeply attached to Brian, is a fine premise for a character. It produced some good television. The Stewie and Brian Road episodes across several seasons of the revival run are among the show's more entertaining recurring features. The relationship between the two characters, whatever its ultimate fate in the later seasons, was a genuinely productive, creative pairing. But the replacement premium was also not original. There are hundreds of animated characters who are emotionally vulnerable and searching for identity and find meaning in their friendship with one specific other character. The comedy of this situation is well-explored territory in animation. It is not boring territory, but it is not new. And the replacement of one of the most original character concepts in American animated television, with a character type that existed abundantly elsewhere, was a specific loss that the show never recovered from. Deep dive. What American Dad tells us about Family Guy. The existence of American Dad is one of the more interesting pieces of evidence available when trying to understand Family Guy's trajectory, because it is a natural experiment in what happens to a Seth MacFarlane animated comedy when different creative choices are made. American Dad premiered in February of 2005, just before Family Guy's 4th season began, and was created by MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show shared a creator, a network, a broadcast night, and a general format with Family Guy. It was animated in a style that reflected the same visual conventions. The voice performances had the same general production quality. The shows were genuine siblings, and they went in completely different directions. American Dad did not use cutaway gags. This single decision changed the show's structural requirements entirely. Without the ability to fill time and generate laughs by cutting to unrelated scenes, The writers had to make every episode work as a complete story. Every joke had to come from the characters. Every funny moment had to be earned through plot. The writing discipline imposed by the absence of cutaway gags forced the show to develop something that Family Guy's revival seasons were losing: strong storytelling fundamentals. The characters on American Dad also developed differently than the Family Guy characters. Stan Smith, the patriotic CIA agent patriarch, began as a more overtly satirical figure than Peter Griffin, his conservatism more specifically targeted, his character initially less complex. But across the show's run, Stan developed genuine complexity. He was stubborn and often wrong, but he loved his family in ways that remained consistent and that the show continued to honor even when it was making him the target of satire. He grew, slowly and imperfectly, in ways that were legible from episode to episode. Roger the Alien, voiced by McFarlane, became one of the most creative characters in American animated television through a premise that was endlessly generative rather than limited. His ability to adopt complete alternate personas, becoming entirely different characters with different names and backstories across different episodes. This is the opposite of the creative failure mode that consumed the Stewie premise. Roger's central character concept was designed to be inexhaustible, to offer new angles indefinitely. The show took a lesson from the kind of creative thinking that had produced the early Stewie and built a character whose premise was structurally designed never to run dry. Francine Smith avoided the trajectory that damaged Lois Griffin. The writing for Francine maintained her as a complete person across the show's run, someone whose warmth and competence and occasional darkness were all present and balanced, rather than being selectively emphasized based on what any given episode needed her to be. The show moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season, a transition that gave it more creative freedom and that the show navigated successfully, continuing to produce quality episodes after the network change in a way that suggests the move was not a catastrophe but an opportunity. The show has continued to run and to maintain its quality at a level that Family Guy, across roughly the same span of broadcast years, has not matched. The comparison is not intended to diminish either show. American Dad has its own faults and its own failures, and there are arguments to be made that its political satire became less sharp as American political culture became less amenable to the kind of gentle satirical treatment it deployed. But its consistent maintenance of character integrity and storytelling quality, compared to Family Guy's inconsistent and frequently declining relationship with both, is evidence that the direction Family Guy took was not inevitable. It was chosen, and a different set of choices, made in a different writer's room applying different values to the same general format, produced something that aged better. Deep Dive. Seth MacFarlane and the show he left and kept. The relationship between Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy in its later years is one of the more unusual creator-to-creation relationships in American television. He did not leave the show in any formal sense. He continued to voice all of his characters. He continued to receive executive producer credits. He continued to be publicly associated with Family Guy as its creator, in the way that creators of long-running institutions are associated with them, regardless of how much day-to-day involvement they maintain. But his creative engagement with the show diminished substantially around 2011 and 2012, the period during which he was developing and then releasing Ted, his first feature film as a director. Ted was a massive commercial success, earning over $500 million worldwide on a budget of approximately $50 million. It established MacFarlane as a commercially viable film director and producer, and it opened up the kind of broader entertainment career that his work on Family Guy had made possible in principle, but that required a specific demonstration of box office viability to actually pursue. After Ted, he made A Million Ways to Die in the West, which was less successful commercially, but which he has described as a more personally satisfying creative project. He made Ted 2. He created The Orville, a science fiction series that was initially greeted with some skepticism, being perceived by some critics as an extended Star Trek parody, but that developed across its seasons into a genuinely serious science fiction show with strong character writing and an evident commitment to the humanistic values that underpin the best of the genre it was working within. The Orville, in particular, is interesting in the context of Family Guy because it demonstrates what MacFarlane's creative ambitions look like when he is fully engaged and fully in control of the creative process. The show is warm. It takes its characters seriously. It is interested in ideas and willing to develop them at length. It is, in short, the kind of show that someone who genuinely loved the best qualities of the early Family Guy might make when given the opportunity to pursue those qualities without the constraints of an already established franchise with a specific audience and a specific set of expectations. The creator of Family Guy and the creator of The Orville are the same person. The values expressed in The Orville's best episodes are consistent with the values expressed in Family Guy's best episodes. The difference is the degree of engagement, the degree of control, and the degree to which the show's ongoing operation required MacFarlane to protect what he cared about versus allowing other people's decisions to accumulate into something he might not have chosen. In 2021, MacFarlane posted on social media expressing his frustration with Fox News, the cable news network that shared corporate heritage with the Fox broadcast network that aired his shows. He described his discomfort with the association, the feeling of being connected through his business relationship to a news operation whose editorial positions he found deeply objectionable. He was not subtle about this. He said he wished Family Guy was on a different network. A creator publicly stating that they wish their show was on a different network than the one it is on is a specific and unusual thing. It is not the statement of someone who is finding deep professional satisfaction in the ongoing production of the work. It is the statement of someone who is, in an important sense, done, even if the contractual and economic realities of their situation prevent them from being actually done. The show has continued. It will continue. The renewal deals are in place. The economics still work. Family Guy will probably reach its 30th anniversary while still in production, which will make it one of the longest-running animated comedies in American television history, a distinction that says nothing about its quality and everything about its commercial durability. MacFarlane built something that was genuinely great in its early years, and something that has genuinely declined across its later years, and something that has never quite stopped being significant even in its diminished state. The significance and the decline coexist. The creation and the creator's complicated relationship with it coexist. The show is what it is. The show was what it was. Both things are part of the same history. Deep Dive, the comedy of cruelty and what it costs. There is a specific argument that defenders of Family Guy's more difficult content have made consistently across the show's history, and it is worth taking seriously before examining where it falls short. The argument goes like this. Comedy has always included cruelty. Cruelty is part of what comedy is, structurally. The slapstick tradition is built on physical harm. The put-down tradition is built on social harm. Satire is built on making powerful people look foolish. Even at its most genteel, comedy involves someone being at the butt of the joke, someone being the one whose dignity is violated by the punchline. Family Guy did not invent the comedy of cruelty. It is participating in a tradition as old as comedy itself. This argument is true, as far as it goes, and the people who make it are not being dishonest or evasive. They are accurately describing something real about the history and the structure of comedy. Aristophanes made fun of Socrates. Shakespeare put clowns in his tragedies to say things about powerful people that could not be said directly. Chaplin's tramp was always the butt of a universe that would not accommodate him. The cruelty is baked in. But the argument falls short because it elides an important distinction, which is the distinction between cruelty that serves something and cruelty that does not. The best comedy that involves cruelty uses it in service of a truth that is not available through gentler means. The cruelty is the necessary condition for the insight. You cannot get to what the tramp tells you about industrial society without showing the tramp ground up in the gears of the machine. The harm is the point. The harm illuminates something. When Family Guy at its worst deployed cruelty, particularly in the sustained treatment of Meg, the cruelty was not in service of a truth. It was not illuminating anything about Meg or about the family or about the experience of teenage girls in American culture or about anything beyond the specific dynamic of a show that had discovered that humiliating one character consistently generated the kind of audience response that kept writers returning to the same well. The cruelty was in service of itself, of the laugh it produced, of the ongoing structure of a character being humiliated that required continued humiliation to maintain. There is a version of the Meg storyline that could have used the cruelty of the family's treatment toward her to illuminate something true about how families designate one of their members as the carrier of collective dysfunction. There is a version of the story that could have used Meg's experience to say something real about what it costs a young woman to be consistently told by the people who are supposed to love her most that she is worth less than the other people around her. These are real things. They happen in real families. Comedy can reach them. Family Guy had the raw material for that version of the story. Seahorse Seashell Party demonstrates that, briefly, before taking it back. The show had access to the truth of Meg's situation and kept choosing not to use it as anything other than comedy fuel. The cruelty remained. The illumination did not happen. This is the specific failure mode of Family Guy's comedy of cruelty. Not that it was cruel, but that the cruelty was unearned by anything that justified its cost. Comedy can justify cruelty by putting it in service of something larger than the laugh. Family Guy's cruelty, in its worst manifestations, was all cost and no justification. Deep dive. The Parents Television Council and the regulators. No discussion of Family Guy's history is complete without some attention to the organizations and regulatory bodies that spent significant portions of their institutional energy objecting to the show across its long run. The Parents Television Council is a nonprofit advocacy organization founded in 1995 by conservative media critic L. Brent Bozell III. The organization monitors American television content and advocates for programming standards that it considers appropriate for family viewing. It has, across its history, focused particular attention on primetime broadcast programming, which is the category that receives both the largest audiences and the most Federal Communications Commission regulatory oversight. Family Guy appeared on the Parents Television Council's annual list of the worst primetime shows for family viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006. These designations were not accidental. The PTC tracked specific episodes and specific moments, building cases for why the show crossed the lines that the organization's standards defined. The complaints were detailed, episode-specific, and filed with both the FCC and with the Fox network directly. The FCC received significant volumes of complaints about Family Guy across its broadcast history. The Commission's authority over broadcast television content is real, but constrained by constitutional protections for speech. The FCC can regulate obscenity and can fine broadcast networks for content that meets specific legal definitions of indecency. It cannot simply regulate content that is offensive in a general sense, or that advocacy organizations object to. The complaints about Family Guy that the FCC received, in most cases, involve material that the Commission determined did not meet the legal threshold for actionable indecency. The regulatory framework that governs broadcast television in the United States is, by design, limited. The First Amendment protects a great deal of speech that individuals and organizations find offensive, and the FCC's authority is bounded by those protections. The result is that a show can produce content that generates thousands of regulatory complaints and that multiple advocacy organizations describe as harmful, and the FCC can do little if the content does not meet specific legal standards. This creates a situation that both defenders and critics of Family Guy have found frustrating, for different reasons. Defenders find it frustrating because they believe the regulatory complaints represent an attempt to censor creative work that has a right to exist. Critics find it frustrating because the regulatory framework seems to offer no meaningful protection against content that they believe causes harm, even if it does not meet the legal definition of indecency. Fox, as the broadcasting network, occupies a position between the regulatory complaints and the show's creators. Fox is subject to FCC oversight in ways that cable networks are not. It has advertiser relationships that it is careful to protect. It has a broad national audience that includes people across the full range of American cultural and political perspectives. When the PTC filed complaints, or when the FCC received significant volumes of letters about a specific episode, Fox was in the position of having to weigh the regulatory and commercial risks of the complaint against the value of the content being complained about. In most cases, Fox concluded that the content was worth defending. The show aired. The complaints were addressed through public statements or through the regulatory process, and the episodes remained in the broadcast record. Fox's willingness to defend the show against regulatory complaints is part of the reason the show's most controversial broadcast episodes made it to air at all. The one episode that Fox chose not to defend, by choosing not to air it in the first place, was Partial Terms of Endearment. The calculation there was different. Not that the episode violated FCC standards, but that its subject matter would generate a specific kind of public controversy that Fox was not willing to absorb. The distinction between those two calculations, between content that is legally regulable and content that is merely commercially risky, is the distinction that tells you the most about how American broadcast television actually makes decisions about what to air. Deep Dive: The show in 2024 and what remains. As of this recording, Family Guy has been renewed through its 27th season. The renewal was announced in April of 2025 as a significant deal with Disney, the corporate parent of the Fox broadcast network and of 20th Century Television, which produces Family Guy. The terms of the renewal guarantee episodes through the 2028 to 2029 television season, which would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. 30 years. The show that Seth MacFarlane pitched to Fox in May of 1998, that premiered in January of 1999, that was canceled twice and came back from cancellation twice, that has generated more regulatory complaints and advocacy organization press releases than almost any other animated comedy in American television history, will, if the renewal holds, be in production through its 30th year. What does the show look like in its mid-20s seasons? The critical consensus, for whatever it is worth, is that the show has stabilized at a level that is neither its early brilliance nor its middle period depths. The most egregious treatment of Meg has been walked back to some degree. The characters are not quite as flanderized as they were at their worst. There are still episodes that are genuinely funny, still moments that reflect the original intelligence and warmth of the early show. There are still episodes that produce the specific discomfort of comedy that is not quite doing enough with the discomfort it generates. The show is on Wednesday nights. That is the practical reality of its current position in American network television. The move from Sunday nights, from the animation domination block that had been its home across most of its revival run, is the most visible sign of where the show stands, with Fox's current programming priorities. It is not the flagship it once was. It is a reliable and inexpensive piece of the schedule, a show that generates enough revenue through its content ecosystem to justify its continued production regardless of what the weekly ratings look like. Seth MacFarlane is still doing the voices. He has said in interviews that he does not see a compelling reason to stop, that the show still generates revenue that he can apply to causes he cares about, that it makes people happy in the specific and modest way that a familiar show in a comfortable time slot makes people happy. These are honest reasons to keep doing something. They are not the reasons of someone who is artistically compelled by what they are making, but they are honest. The show's legacy, when it is eventually considered from whatever distance the future will provide, is going to be complicated in the way that the legacies of genuinely significant creative works are always complicated. It changed American animated television. It demonstrated that an animated comedy could build a large enough audience to survive cancellation and come back. It developed and popularized a specific comedic format, the cutaway gag, that has influenced countless subsequent shows. It produced in its early seasons work that holds up as genuinely excellent television, and in its later seasons, work that holds up as a case study in what happens to creative ambition when commercial considerations and creative fatigue and the departure of original creative energy are left to work on each other without sufficient counterbalance. It also produced the controversies we have described tonight. Every banned episode, every pulled episode, every moment that made people wonder what they were laughing at and whether they had been right to laugh at it. These are part of the legacy too. They are part of what Family Guy put into the culture, into the ongoing conversation about what comedy is for and what it is allowed to do, and where the line is between illuminating discomfort and merely generating it. The show will keep running, more episodes will be made, more moments will be created that sit in the complicated space between comedy and something harder to name. And all of it will accumulate into the continuing history of a show that was, at its best, genuinely great, and that has spent the better part of 2 decades working out, imperfectly and publicly and sometimes painfully, what happens to a great show when the conditions that made it great change and the show keeps running anyway? That is Family Guy. That is its history. That is what we have spent these hours together describing. Deep Dive. The episodes that almost were pulled, delayed, and nearly made. The controversies that made it to air are the ones that define the public history of Family Guy's difficult relationship with difficult material. But alongside those controversies is a category of material that almost existed, that was written or conceived or partially produced, and then did not survive to broadcast, for reasons that range from network caution to the practical pressures of production. The Weinstein episode is the clearest example of the almost made category, though it eventually did make it to air after a 3-year delay. The gap between its production and its broadcast is itself a document of the negotiation process that happens between creators and networks when content sits in a zone of commercial uncertainty. The episode was good enough to produce. It was not considered safe enough to broadcast immediately. The eventual decision to air it, first on Adult Swim and then on Fox, reflects a recalibration of that calculation over time. There are other episodes in the show's history that were altered significantly before broadcast in response to network notes. The process of getting an animated comedy from a writer's room to a completed broadcast episode involves multiple rounds of review, and network notes at various stages can result in content being changed, cut, or restructured in ways that alter the finished product substantially from what was originally written. The episodes that air are not always the episodes that were written. They are the episodes that were written and then survived the production and review process. The show's writers have, in various interviews across the years, described notes that changed specific episodes in specific ways, though the details are not always public and the show is not one that has produced an extensive oral history of its production process. What can be said with confidence is that the episodes that the public has found controversial represent the content that survived the review process. The content that did not survive is, by definition, unknown in its specific details, though its existence as a category can be inferred from the general practices of network television production. This matters because it complicates the picture of how Family Guy's most controversial content came to exist. The episodes were not produced in isolation and then broadcast without review. They were produced within a system that had multiple opportunities to catch and address content that crossed lines the network considered actionable. The content that made it through that system and caused controversy represents the judgment of that system, not only the judgment of the writers. Fox aired these episodes. Fox looked at them and determined that they were within the range of content it was willing to broadcast. The controversies that followed belong, in part, to the institution as well as to the individuals. The partial terms of endearment exception is the clearest evidence that Fox's review process was capable of stopping content from reaching the airwaves when the network considered the risk too significant. The episode existed. Fox saw it. Fox decided not to air it. This means that for every episode that did air and that generated controversy, a judgment was made that the controversy was manageable. The controversy was the price of the content, and Fox determined, in each case except one, that the price was worth paying. Deep Dive. The broader landscape where Family Guy sits in American comedy history. 25 years after its premiere, Family Guy occupies a specific and identifiable position in the history of American animated comedy, a position that is both more significant and more complicated than the position it might have seemed to be occupying at any given point in its run. It is more significant than it might seem because the show changed what animated comedy on American network television could look like. Before Family Guy, the available models for animated primetime comedy were essentially The Simpsons, which had established the dysfunctional family in a recognizable American suburb format, and Futurama, which had taken McFarlane's own Rhode Island School of Design contemporary, Matt Groening, into science fiction territory. The Simpsons had been running for a decade by the time Family Guy premiered, and had established a grammar for the genre that was so thoroughly naturalized that it was difficult to imagine animated primetime comedy looking substantially different from what The Simpsons had made it. Family Guy made it look different. The cutaway format, whatever its later problems, was a genuine formal innovation in the context of American primetime animation. It changed the rhythm of the shows that followed: Bob's Burgers, Archer, and Rick and Morty. All shows that emerged in the years after Family Guy established the viability of the cutaway-inflected animated comedy format owe something to the space that Family Guy opened up. The tradition of adult animated comedy that currently thrives across both broadcast and cable and streaming owes a structural debt to Family Guy's demonstration that the format could sustain a mass audience. It is more complicated than it might seem because the show's legacy is permanently divided between its early seasons and its later seasons in ways that most other shows' legacies are not. The Simpsons has a similar division in its legacy between the first 8 or so seasons and everything that followed, but The Simpsons at least maintained enough consistency that the division requires some argument to establish. Family Guy's division is more dramatic. The gap between what the first 3 seasons were and what the revival seasons became is large enough to be visible without close examination. The legacy is therefore the legacy of 2 different shows that share a name and a cast and a premise, and evaluating that legacy requires deciding which of those shows you are talking about. The show's relationship to American culture across its run is itself a document of how that culture changed. The controversies of the early seasons, the Weinstein episode, the Parents Television Council campaigns, the FCC complaints, were controversies that reflected the early 2000s cultural landscape, a landscape in which the culture wars around media content were being fought in terms that have since evolved substantially. The controversies of the later seasons, the transgender episode, the domestic violence episode, the Meg treatment, reflect the cultural landscape of the 2010s, a landscape in which the frameworks for thinking about representation and harm and the relationship between comedy and accountability had developed in ways that made the earlier controversies look different and produced new controversies that the earlier frameworks had not anticipated. A show that runs for 25 years is running across several different versions of its cultural context. What was controversial in 2000 was not always controversial in 2010, and what was controversial in 2010 was not always controversial in 2020. The show's history is also a history of how the culture it operated within changed and did not change, of what questions remained live across decades, and what questions got settled and what new questions emerged to replace them. Family Guy kept running. That is the simple fact that underlies everything else. Whatever happened to its creative ambitions, whatever happened to its characters and its comedy and its relationship with its creator, the show kept being made and kept being watched and kept generating the conversations that long-running, complicated, significant creative works generate. That persistence is itself a kind of statement, though what exactly it is a statement about is something that the next 25 years, if the show makes them, will probably help clarify. For now, in the quiet of this particular night, with everything we have described settling into whatever part of your mind it finds a place in, it is enough to note that it existed, and that its existence mattered, and that the mattering was complicated in ways that made it worth spending time on, which is what we have been doing here. The show that began on a January night in 1999, with 22 million people watching, is still being made. It will probably still be being made when the people who watched it on that first night have grandchildren old enough to watch it on whatever screen exists then. The history we have described tonight will be part of whatever those grandchildren encounter when they look back at what American television was doing in the first quarter of the 21st century. That is a strange and interesting legacy for a cartoon about a fat man and a talking dog. A final note before sleep. There is something specific about spending time with a show's history in this format, in the dark, in a calm voice, at length, that is different from watching a video essay or reading a critical piece. The pace of it matters. The unhurried quality of moving through something without rushing it, without the obligation to have a hot take or reach a conclusion or arrive anywhere in particular, is its own kind of experience. Family Guy gave the people who watched it, across 25 years, a great many different experiences. It gave them the experience of laughing at things that were very funny. It gave them the experience of laughing at things that were funny in ways that required examination afterward. It gave them the experience of watching characters they cared about change into versions of themselves that were harder to care about. It gave them the experience of being surprised, occasionally and genuinely, by an episode that was better than they expected the show to be. It gave them the experience of controversy, of watching a piece of culture they had been following for years suddenly become the subject of national conversation, of having to decide where they stood in relation to something they had been enjoying without friction. It gave them the experience of loyalty to something they loved, even when the thing they loved was not quite what it had been, and of grief for what was lost, even in the presence of something still recognizably there. All of these experiences are part of what 25 years of watching the same show produces in an audience. The audience for Family Guy is not and was never a monolith. It is millions of individual people who came to the show at different times, for different reasons, with different frameworks for understanding what they were watching and different thresholds for what they were comfortable with. What any of them took from it depended on what they brought to it. What we have tried to do tonight is give that history, with all its complexity, the space it deserves. To describe what happened without overstating what it means, to be honest about the failures without erasing the accomplishments, to be honest about the accomplishments without softening the failures. The show is still running. There will be more to describe eventually. But for tonight, this is where we leave it, with the history of 25 years of a complicated, significant, sometimes brilliant, sometimes genuinely difficult piece of American comedy, described in a calm voice, in the dark, at the pace that the material requires. Sleep well, the rest will still be here in the morning.